The American Civil War had ended, but its legacy was far from over. The South had been shattered, its economy destroyed, its plantations abandoned, and its people left grappling with a new reality. Emancipation had freed 4 million enslaved black men, women, and children, and for the first time in history, the foundations of the old Southern hierarchy were crumbling. But while the Union had won the war, it had not won the battle for equality. White Southerners, humiliated by defeat and enraged by the loss of their way of life, refused to accept their new place in society. And in the shadows of Reconstruction, they found a way to fight back. Not through laws, not through politics, but through terror. The Ku Klux Klan was about to rise. If you enjoy listening to history while going to sleep, consider subscribing to explore more deep historical narrations. Also, let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. The South lay in ruins. Once thriving plantations stood empty, their fields overgrown and silent, without the enslaved labor that had sustained them for generations. Confederate soldiers, many of whom had spent years fighting for a lost cause, returned home to find their towns barely recognizable. Government buildings destroyed, businesses closed, families struggling to survive. But what was most unbearable was not the destruction. It was the humiliation. The institution that had built the South, slavery, was gone, and in its place, black men and women were free, walking the streets, earning wages, starting businesses, and even registering to vote. To the former Confederates, this was not just defeat. It was the erasure of their entire identity. The trauma of Confederate defeat and the sudden abolition of slavery ignited a storm of rage, fear, and hatred, setting the stage for the birth of an organization that would terrorize the nation for generations to come. The power vacuum created space for something dark to emerge. The end of the Civil War should have brought resolution, but instead, it birthed resentment, fear, and a desperate grasp at lost power. For white Southerners, defeat was more than just a surrender. It was a complete unraveling of their world, a humiliation that permeated their homes, and their communities, and their very identities. The South had fought, blood, and died to preserve slavery, believing it to be a cornerstone of civilization, an unshakable truth that defined their economy, their politics, and their personal relationships. But now, that institution was gone. And with it, their control over black lives had vanished, as Union troops enforced the laws of Reconstruction, ensuring that black men could vote, own land, receive education, and participate in government. Southern resentment boiled over. Confederate veterans returned home to find their families destitute, their homes unrecognizable, their places of privilege erased. They had once ruled over black men and women with a whip, a deed, and a set of laws that reinforced their dominance. Now, they saw those same people walking the streets as free citizens, forging futures without permission, carving out an existence that white men could no longer dictate. This was not just a loss, it was a nightmare. The abolition of slavery sparked a deep and embedding rage, one that could not be contained by Reconstruction laws or federal oversight. White Southerners saw themselves as defeated, but not destroyed, and their former slaves as threats rather than equals. Black political gains in the post-war years only intensified their fury. The sight of black men voting, black families purchasing land, black politicians rising to office was too much to bear. These victories challenged the very fabric of white supremacy, and to many, it felt like an invasion of their most sacred beliefs. The South would never accept racial equality, not willingly. And so, rather than concede, they searched for ways to fight back, to restore control, to remind freedmen that though their chains were gone, they were never truly free. Across the ruined landscapes of the South, whispers of defiance began to spread. Former Confederates, plantation owners, local leaders, and bitter war veterans gathered behind closed doors, muttering about retribution, about restoring the order they had lost. They could no longer legally enslave, but they could still strike fear into the hearts of those who had dared to rise. The battlefield had changed, from open war to stealth, secrecy and terror, and as Reconstruction pushed forward, the power vacuum created space for something dark to emerge. The South had been shattered, its old rulers dethroned, its laws rewritten, and its racial hierarchy forcibly dismantled by the Union's victory. But while Reconstruction sought to rebuild the region into a democracy where black men were equal under the law, white resentment had not disappeared. It had festered, growing into something darker. Confederate veterans, plantation owners, and displaced aristocrats were no longer the masters of enslaved men and women. Their political strongholds had collapsed. Their wealth had evaporated, and their grip on power had been pried loose by federal oversight. But losing the war did not mean losing their ideology, their belief in white supremacy, or their determination to regain control. If they could no longer command through law, they would rule through terror. The power vacuum that followed the war was a breeding ground for rebellion. Union troops patrolled southern towns, enforcing laws that granted former slaves the right to vote, own land, and participate in government. But the resentment among white Southerners was palpable. At first, opposition was quiet. A refusal to acknowledge black freedom, a slow dismantling of Reconstruction policies where possible, a push to undermine black economic and political gains. But this resistance was not enough. The humiliation of defeat had struck deep, and many former Confederates refused to accept a future where black men could stand as equals. This was not just about politics, it was about identity, about restoring the supremacy that had defined the South for generations. In their minds, the war had ended, but their fight was far from over. And so, within the void left by Confederate collapse, something new began to take shape. It would not wear the uniform of the Southern Army, nor march on open battlefields. It would move under the cover of night, unseen but deeply feared. It would promise to restore order, to reclaim dominance, to strike back against the forces that had undone the South. It would be an empire within an empire, hidden, secretive, and bound by a singular purpose. The invisible empire was about to be born. In Pulaski, Tennessee, 6 Confederate officers gathered under the guise of forming a social club. But what emerged from their meeting was something far more sinister. The Ku Klux Klan was about to rise. In the small town of Pulaski, Tennessee, 6 former Confederate officers gathered in secret, searching for purpose, for brotherhood, for a way to reclaim the power they had lost. The war was over, their army defeated, their cause crushed, but their hatred, their need for control, remained intact. The idea was simple at first, a club, something informal, an exclusive group for former Confederate soldiers, bonded by their shared loss, their wounded pride, and their unshaken belief in white supremacy. There was no grand political agenda, no structured plan, just a desire to create something that belonged to them alone, something that would bring back the sense of dominance that had slipped through their fingers with emancipation. What began as a casual gathering soon evolved into something more organized. The men understood what had been stolen from them. Their authority, their ability to dictate the lives of others, their control over black Americans. And though slavery had ended, they refused to accept a world where black men could walk freely, own property, vote, hold office, live without fear of their former masters. Reconstruction had given Black Americans a chance to build lives beyond the chains they had been born into. But to the men in Pulaski, that progress was an attack. They needed to remind freedmen that true freedom did not exist. Not in the South, not under their watch. Their group needed an identity, something secret, something powerful, something intimidating. And so, they settled on a name drawn from ancient Greek, Ku Klux Klan, a term meant to invoke mystery, exclusivity, and fear. It was a name designed to spread, to inspire whispers, to sound like an order that had existed long before the war. And with the name came rituals, rules, hierarchy, and symbols that would set them apart. They adopted disguises, hoods and robes meant to create an air of ghostly menace, as if they were not mere men, but something beyond the living, something that could not be stopped. At first, it was a joke, mockery, theatrics, absurd ceremony. They rode under the cover of night, appearing suddenly in black communities dressed in white robes, claiming to be the ghosts of Confederate soldiers, warning freedmen that the past was not truly buried. The spectacle was ridiculous, almost childish, but it had an unexpected effect. Fear. Freedmen, many of whom had lived their entire lives under the cruelty of slavery, understood the unspoken message beneath the costumes. This was not play acting, it was intimidation. The past was coming for them. The war had never truly ended. And the men who had once owned them would not let them live in peace. The theatrics quickly turned into something far more violent. What began as mockery and costumes swiftly became targeted terror. At first, the Ku Klux Klan seemed like nothing more than a cruel joke, a theatrical display designed to frighten freedmen without direct confrontation. The former Confederate officers who had formed the group treated it as an exclusive brotherhood, a secret club where they could indulge in the mythology of the Old South, while mocking the new reality forced upon them. Dressed in robes and hoods, riding horses draped in white sheets, they took to the streets at night, appearing suddenly in black communities like ghostly figures, claiming to be the spirits of dead Confederate soldiers. The spectacle was absurd, but its intent was clear: to remind freedmen that true freedom did not exist in the South, that the war had changed laws but not minds. And while Union forces were tasked with maintaining order, they could not control what happened in the shadows. The disguise was effective. Freedmen, many of whom had lived their entire lives under the brutality of slavery, understood the message beneath the costumes. The figures in the night were not play acting. They were a warning. And when that warning failed to instill enough fear, the Klan escalated. The first targets were black leaders, freedmen who had begun carving out positions of power, whether in politics, business, or education. A black man who dared to teach other freedmen how to read, who dared to organize voters, who dared to step into positions of influence, became a marked man. The Klan's tactics shifted from simple intimidation to targeted violence. Homes were raided, schools were burned. Freedmen were dragged from their beds at night and beaten, whipped, or murdered. Their deaths meant to serve as a public message. Black ambition would not be tolerated. Once the killings began, the Klan found its true purpose. It was no longer just a social club. It was a force of terror, a secret army dedicated to preserving white supremacy through bloodshed. White Southerners, desperate to reclaim the power they had lost, flocked to the organization, eager to participate in its mission. The hoods and robes, once part of a theatrical performance, became a symbol of anonymity, allowing men to commit atrocities without revealing their identities. Their victims could never know, who among their neighbors was responsible, could never guess who was behind the mask, which made the Klan's presence all the more terrifying. As violence escalated, so did the Klan's influence. Word spread quickly, through whispers, through newspaper reports, through brutal public displays of violence, meant to reinforce its dominance. Freedmen understood what was happening. Their lives were no longer their own, and white Southerners embraced the Klan, either out of fear or approval, watching as it reclaimed control in the absence of Confederate rule. Governments turned a blind eye, law enforcement failed to intervene, and soon, the Klan spread like wildfire through fear, secrecy, and symbolism. Crosses, hoods, fire. The Ku Klux Klan's rapid rise was fueled by fear, secrecy, and the powerful symbolism of terror. What had started as a small group in Pulaski, Tennessee, was now spreading across the South like wildfire, infiltrating communities, poisoning minds, and reshaping the post-war landscape into something horrifyingly familiar, a place where white supremacy could thrive despite legal abolition. The Klan understood that direct warfare was over, but intimidation, brutality, and psychological manipulation could achieve the same results that slavery once had. And so, their methods evolved into something more insidious, more deeply rooted in the power of fear. Secrecy became their greatest weapon. No one knew exactly who was in the Klan, only that its presence was undeniable, lurking in every corner of the South. Hoods masked identities, ensuring that victims never knew if the men attacking them were their neighbors, their employers, or their local lawmen. This anonymity ensured impunity, a guarantee that no one would face justice, because no one could be identified. Even those who were not official members of the Klan participated in its violence, emboldened by the knowledge that white society would protect them. It was not just a group, it was a movement, an invisible force behind Reconstruction's collapse. Symbolism fueled the fear. The burning cross, the hooded figures, the midnight rides, each carried a message. The cross itself, set aflame in the dead of night, was a twisted representation of spiritual warfare, as if the Klan was claiming divine justification for its brutality. Fire became the hallmark of their violence. Flames consuming schools, churches, businesses owned by freedmen, ensuring that black progress was erased before it could take root. And when it wasn't fire, it was blood. Victims were dragged from their beds, stolen from the safety of their homes, forced to answer for crimes they had not committed. Crimes of existing freely, crimes of ambition, crimes of simply being black in a South that refused to let go of the past. Governments failed to intervene. Many turned a blind eye, while others were actively complicit, allowing Klan violence to go unpunished, unchecked, and unchallenged. Freedmen, isolated and outnumbered, had few options. They could flee, they could submit, or they could resist, knowing that resistance might bring death, destruction, and retribution that could stretch beyond themselves to their families, their communities, their hopes for the future. Freedom had been promised, but the reality was clear: without protection, without enforcement, without true justice, freedom was an illusion. And so, the Klan's reign deepened, its influence expanding as terror became law. Terror in the Night, the first Klan's reign, 1866-1871. Freedmen were targeted in their own homes, lynchings, beatings, arson. Their survival was not just a battle, it was a war waged against their existence. The Ku Klux Klan's reign of terror intensified, spreading like an unchecked fire through the South, leaving behind a trail of blood and devastation. Freedmen, who had dared to dream of real freedom, who had carved out homes, built communities, and tried to forge lives beyond their former bondage, found themselves trapped in a nightmare. The Klan did not simply threaten them, it hunted them. Lynching became a ritual, a public spectacle designed not just to kill, but to send a message to every black family in the region. Victims were dragged from their homes, stripped of dignity, and tortured before being hanged from trees. Their bodies left as warnings to those who thought they could challenge the old order. Beatings were common. Carried out in the dead of night, masked riders breaking into houses, tearing men from their families, and reminding them that resistance would be met with brutality. Arson became another favored weapon. Homes, schools, barns, even entire black neighborhoods burned to the ground under the Klan's orders. The flames consumed more than wood and stone. They destroyed hope, leaving black families homeless, forcing them to relive the horrors of displacement that had haunted them since the days of slavery. And when fire wasn't enough, the Klan turned to abduction, making men vanish into the night, never to be seen again. The killings were not indiscriminate. The Klan had a clear agenda: to eliminate those who fought for black progress, those who dared to uplift freedmen, those who refused to be silenced. As the years passed, their targets expanded beyond individual freedmen. It was not enough to kill former slaves in the streets. The Klan needed to choke the very institutions that supported them. Teachers, politicians, and black churches became frequent victims. The Ku Klux Klan understood that terror was most effective when it struck not just individuals, but entire communities, institutions, and symbols of black progress. Their goal was never simply to intimidate freedmen. It was to dismantle the very structure of their newfound freedom, to ensure that no black person could rise without consequence. The early years of Reconstruction had seen former slaves seizing opportunities, learning to read, building businesses, voting in elections, and even winning political office. Black teachers, ministers, and politicians became crucial leaders, guiding freedmen toward a future that had once been unimaginable. But with every step forward, the Klan lurked in the shadows, waiting to crush that progress before it could take root. Teachers, especially those who taught literacy to black students, were seen as an existential threat to white supremacy. Many freedmen had been denied education for generations, and now, in the aftermath of the Civil War, they were finally learning to read, gaining knowledge that could empower them politically and economically. The Klan recognized the danger this posed. An educated black population meant informed voters, strong leaders, and independent thinkers. So they struck fast. Schools were burned to the ground, teachers were beaten, and some were murdered outright. Their bodies left as grim warnings to anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. White Southern officials often refused to prosecute these crimes, dismissing them as isolated incidents or, worse, justified acts of social control. Politicians faced the same brutal fate. Black men who had managed to gain political office, many of them former slaves, were targeted without mercy. They represented the ultimate insult to the old Southern order. Black men making laws, governing cities, shaping policies that affected both black and white citizens alike. The Klan responded with assassinations, public executions, and relentless intimidation campaigns. Ballots were stolen, election officials were murdered, and black voters were threatened away from polling places. Many freedmen who attempted to vote were beaten within an inch of their lives, their ballots torn from their hands, their homes destroyed in retaliation. Where democracy should have flourished, terror took its place, ensuring that Reconstruction's promise was systematically undone. Churches, the heart of black communities, became prime targets. Religion had long been a source of strength for enslaved people, a place where they could gather, worship, and find hope beyond the cruelty of their daily lives. After emancipation, black churches became centers for activism, where freedmen organized political meetings, built schools, and supported one another in times of crisis. The Klan saw these churches not as places of faith, but as hubs of resistance, and they moved swiftly to destroy them. Ministers were lynched, congregations attacked during Sunday services, church buildings set ablaze, their ashes left smoldering as a symbol that black communities would never be allowed to thrive without consequence. The brutality of the Klan was not just about murder, it was about systemic destruction, an all-encompassing effort to erase black progress before it could take hold. It was not enough to frighten individuals. The Klan sought to erase education, silence leaders, suppress political influence, and dismantle black community structures entirely. They operated in secrecy under hoods, with the protection of local governments, ensuring that justice was never served, that victims were always ignored, and that the horror remained invisible to those who wished to pretend it did not exist. The horror was systemic, invisible, and devastating. The terror was not confined to isolated acts of violence. It was woven into the very fabric of the South, an invisible force operating in the shadows, erasing black progress with blood and fire. The Ku Klux Klan understood that power did not simply come from brute force alone. It came from fear, from silence, from the knowledge that justice would never come. The horrors they unleashed were systemic, deliberate, and devastating, stretching beyond individual attacks and embedding themselves into the structures of daily life. Freedmen were forced into submission, not by written laws, but by the unspoken rule that any sign of ambition, independence, or defiance could mean death. Black families lived under constant threat, knowing that at any moment, a knock at the door, a figure in the darkness, a fire set in the dead of night could end everything. There was no true escape. Leaving the South meant abandoning everything, and staying meant accepting that freedom was only a fragile illusion. The Klan's terror had no boundaries. It reached into homes, schools, businesses, churches, and political offices, crushing hope before it could fully take root. Newspapers refused to report the full extent of the violence, and white officials turned away, pretending the horror did not exist. The silence became its own kind of weapon, ensuring that the truth was buried beneath layers of denial and complicity. Black Americans who tried to resist found themselves outnumbered, hunted, and crushed beneath the weight of an enemy that wore no single face, followed no single leader, and operated without consequence. As fear spread, Reconstruction governments, the fragile attempt to rebuild the South as a democracy, began to crumble. Politicians who had once supported black rights found themselves threatened, attacked, or assassinated, their offices raided, their laws overturned by mobs who ruled the night. The promise of Reconstruction was slipping away, not because of policy failures, but because the Klan and its allies made it impossible to succeed. They did not simply target individuals. They undermined the very systems that were meant to uphold justice, ensuring that black Americans remained trapped in a society where their rights existed in name only. And when subtle intimidation failed, when elections could not be stolen through threats alone, the Klan and other white supremacist groups turned to mass slaughter. Racial massacres erupted, entire black communities wiped out overnight, their homes burned, their residents executed without trial, their deaths dismissed as unfortunate consequences of unrest. Reconstruction governments were systematically undermined by night riders, and racial massacres, ensuring that white dominance would remain unchallenged, no matter what the law claimed. Reconstruction was supposed to rebuild the South, to create a future where equality was not just a principle written in law, but a reality lived by freedmen who had long been denied basic humanity. But white resistance, violent, calculated, and relentless, began dismantling those efforts before they could take hold. The Klan's reign of terror was not an isolated phenomenon. It was an organized assault on democracy, targeting freedmen, black politicians, educators, and anyone who dared support racial progress. Southern governments, fragile and struggling to enforce Reconstruction policies, found themselves overwhelmed by terror, unable to protect black communities from the growing tide of violence. Night riders, masked Klan members who struck under the cover of darkness, spread fear through towns, striking homes, breaking into schools, burning churches, and lynching black leaders. Their brutality was not random. It was designed to collapse Reconstruction from within, to send a message that black political participation, education, and economic growth would be met with bloodshed. Voting rights became meaningless as intimidation kept freedmen away from polling places, their choices stolen before they could cast a ballot. When threats failed, elections were simply rigged, ballot boxes stuffed, votes erased, and politicians assassinated if they refused to comply. Reconstruction governments were powerless to stop it. And when political terror wasn't enough, racial massacres became the weapon of choice. Entire black communities were attacked, their residents slaughtered, their homes and businesses reduced to ash. The Colfax Massacre of 1873, one of the most notorious instances of mass racial violence, saw white mobs executing black defenders en masse, their bodies left in the streets as warnings. The legal system provided no justice. Many perpetrators went free, their crimes either ignored or excused under the guise of restoring order. Reconstruction governments, tasked with protecting black citizens, had become hollow institutions, stripped of power, abandoned by federal support, and watched by freedmen who realized that the promise of equality had turned into a cruel illusion. For years, President Ulysses S. Grant had watched in frustration as Klan violence undermined his administration's Reconstruction policies. The South had become a battlefield without soldiers, a war waged in secrecy, where terror had replaced Confederate armies. Reports flooded Washington, detailing massacres, burned homes, assassinated politicians, but law enforcement remained helpless, either unwilling or unable to confront the white supremacist groups ruling the South through fear. Grant understood that the Klan had become more than a fringe organization. It was a force threatening to erase the Union's victory. A movement dedicated to ensuring black freedom remained nothing but words on paper. He had no choice but to act. Resistance and crackdown. The federal response, 1871's President Ulysses S. Grant declares war on the Klan. By 1871, the Ku Klux Klan had become more than just a secret society. It was an army of terror, operating beyond the reach of local law. Fueled by the South's refusal to accept black freedom, their violence had crippled Reconstruction, turning elections into battlegrounds, transforming communities into sites of massacre, and ensuring that any black success was met with brutal retaliation. The reports reaching Washington were grim. Freedmen and their allies were being hunted, mutilated, and murdered, their homes burned, their leaders assassinated, their votes stolen. Local governments had collapsed under Klan rule, either cooperating with their terror or failing to stand against it. Justice was impossible in the South. The courts protected Klansmen more than they did their victims. President Ulysses S. Grant understood that the Klan was not just a gang of criminals. It was an insurgency, an extension of the defeated Confederate cause that had simply changed its weapons. In his eyes, the war for freedom had not truly ended. It had simply shifted from the battlefield to the streets, the homes, the ballot boxes. The Klan's ultimate goal was to strip freedmen of every right they had been granted, to rewrite history so that black liberation existed only in name, never in reality. And though Grant had hesitated to deploy federal force in the South, knowing that white Democrats would accuse him of tyranny, he could wait no longer. The nation could not afford to let terror win. So, Grant declared war on the Klan. He recognized that local governments had failed, that Southern courts had been corrupted, that law enforcement was either powerless or complicit. The Klan would not be stopped by warnings, speeches, or political maneuvering. It had to be eradicated from the ground up. If Southern states refused to uphold justice, then the federal government would impose it by force. Congress, recognizing the urgency of the crisis, passed a series of laws designed to crush the Klan's reign. The most powerful of these would reshape the South forever. The Enforcement Acts are passed. Federal troops arrest hundreds. The passage of the Enforcement Acts marked a turning point in the battle against the Ku Klux Klan, signaling that the federal government would no longer tolerate organized white supremacist terror. These laws gave President Ulysses S. Grant the authority to use federal troops to intervene directly in southern states, where local law enforcement had either failed or refused to prosecute Klan violence. For the first time, the invisible empire felt the weight of true consequences. Hundreds of Klansmen were arrested, their secret networks exposed, their leaders forced to flee or face trial. Armed with new federal powers, Grant declared martial law in parts of the South, effectively suspending habeas corpus in order to dismantle the Klan's influence before it could grow stronger. The arrests sent shockwaves through white supremacist circles. Klansmen who had operated with impunity, believing their masks and secrecy would shield them from accountability, suddenly found themselves hunted by federal marshals and Union troops. The Klan had thrived under the protection of state governments, but now their sanctuary was collapsing, their methods exposed, their power weakened. Entire Klan chapters were dismantled, leaders imprisoned, followers scattered, operations abandoned. Many fled into hiding, fearful that the tide had turned against them. Southern politicians, once silently complicit in Klan violence, began to distance themselves from the organization, realizing that their own positions could be at risk if they continued to harbor white terror groups. The crackdown worked, at least for a time. By 1872, reports of Klan activity had diminished significantly, and some believed the group had been effectively crushed. Its members either arrested or too afraid to continue their reign of terror. But while the visible presence of the Klan faded, the ideology that had fueled it did not disappear. White supremacist beliefs remained deeply entrenched in the South, finding new outlets through restrictive laws, political maneuvering, and economic oppression. The Klan may have retreated from its public displays of terror, but its influence remained, embedded in policies, in institutions, in whispers behind closed doors. The Enforcement Acts had been a victory, but only a temporary one. Federal troops could arrest Klansmen, could destroy their meeting places, could dismantle their chapters, but they could not erase the hatred that had built the Klan in the first place. And as the years passed, as Reconstruction collapsed under political pressure, as federal intervention waned, as southern states regained control, The forces that had once worn hoods and rode at night found new ways to wield power. The Klan fades, but the hate never dies. It merely goes underground. The federal crackdown on the Ku Klux Klan had shattered its first iteration, forcing its members into hiding, dismantling its structure, and silencing its open reign of terror. But while the Klan's public displays of violence faded, the ideology that fueled it did not disappear. It simply adapted, burrowing into the institutions and laws that would ensure white supremacy remained intact. The hoods and night rides may have been suppressed, but the belief that black Americans were undeserving of equality continued to shape the future of the South. Written into policies, whispered in political meetings, embedded in the very fabric of daily life. The Klan had served its purpose. It had reminded freedmen that their freedom was conditional, that their rights could be revoked at any moment, that white dominance was not gone, merely disguised. As Reconstruction collapsed under political pressure, federal troops withdrew from the South, leaving black communities vulnerable to the unchecked control of white lawmakers, determined to reverse racial progress. The promise of Reconstruction had always been fragile, its success dependent on federal intervention, and once that protection was gone, white elites moved swiftly to reshape the South in their image once more. They did not need the Klan anymore. They had the law, the courts, the economy, and the unchecked power to ensure that black freedom was limited, controlled, and, in many ways, undone. The withdrawal of Union troops in 1877 marked the end of an era, the moment when Southern Democrats regained power. No longer bound by federal oversight, free to implement their own version of justice, their own definition of democracy, one that explicitly excluded black Americans. White supremacists understood that outright violence had drawn too much federal attention, that the Klan had made itself too visible. So rather than continue the same tactics, they shifted to a different kind of oppression, one that was woven into the legal system itself. Slowly, methodically, they dismantled black political influence, passed laws that reinforced racial hierarchy, and ensured that black Americans remained economically dependent on their former enslavers. Black codes and voting restrictions were reintroduced under new names, new justifications, designed to suppress black communities without open displays of terror. White landowners imposed unfair labor contracts, forcing freedmen into cycles of debt that mirrored the bondage they had once endured. Grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes. Each law was a carefully crafted weapon designed to strip black men of their rights without federal interference. The South had learned from the mistakes of the Klan's first rise. It no longer needed an army of masked men. It had elected officials, judges, police officers, and lawmakers to do its bidding instead. White supremacy was no longer just a hidden force. It was written into law, protected by courts, upheld by governments that saw black progress as a threat to their power. And so, as the years passed, the hate that had driven the Klan never died. It merely changed form, evolving from night rides to political suppression, from hoods to legislative chambers. The silence before the storm, the lost cause and white supremacy, 1877-1945, Reconstruction ends, Jim Crow laws begin. With the collapse of Reconstruction, white supremacy reclaimed the South, not with night riders and Klan terror alone, but with laws, policies, and a relentless effort to rewrite history itself. Federal troops had withdrawn, leaving black communities defenseless against the growing tide of suppression, and Southern lawmakers wasted no time in ensuring that black freedom remained nothing but an illusion. The Jim Crow laws swept through the South, enforcing segregation, stripping black citizens of voting rights through poll taxes and literacy tests, and cementing white dominance without the open brutality that had once drawn federal intervention. These laws, carefully crafted and strategically applied, ensured that black Americans remained economically dependent on white employers, legally inferior in the courts, and socially isolated from positions of power. The dream of Reconstruction had been smothered under the weight of bureaucratic oppression, ensuring that racial hierarchy survived in a new, legally sanctioned form. But white leaders understood that it was not enough to control the present. They had to reshape the past as well. The Civil War had ended in humiliation for the South, its Confederate dream shattered, its cause revealed as a desperate fight to preserve slavery, not state rights, not Southern honor, but pure economic and racial subjugation. That truth was too bitter to accept, and so a new narrative emerged, a carefully constructed mythology designed to erase the shame of defeat and replace it with something grand, something noble. The Lost Cause movement took hold, painting the Confederacy not as a failed rebellion fighting for slavery, but as an honorable fight for tradition, for heritage, for the South's dignity against Northern aggression. The war, they claimed, had not been about slavery at all. It had been about Southern identity, about a struggle against tyranny, about heroic men who had fought valiantly and deserved remembrance, not condemnation. And through this revisionist history, the seeds of white supremacy's next resurgence were planted. A new mythology forms. The Lost Cause paints the Confederacy as noble. The end of Reconstruction was not just the collapse of federal intervention. It was the beginning of a deliberate rewrite of history, one designed to erase the truth and replace it with myth. The Confederacy had been defeated. Its vision of a Southern empire built on slavery had crumbled, and its leaders had been forced to admit that their rebellion had failed. But white Southerners, unwilling to accept the shame of that defeat, crafted a new narrative, one that transformed their loss into something honorable, something virtuous, something worth remembering with reverence instead of contempt. Thus, the ideology of the Lost Cause was born. The Lost Cause framed the Civil War, not as a battle for slavery, but as a noble struggle for Southern identity, heritage, and independence. Confederate soldiers, once seen as rebels fighting for an unjust system, were now recast as heroes defending their homeland, their way of life, their families against Northern tyranny. Slavery itself was rewritten. Gone were the brutal whippings, the chains, the auctions, the forced labor. In its place, Southern writers and historians painted a portrait of benevolent masters and loyal slaves, insisting that the war had never truly been about slavery at all. Textbooks were rewritten, memorials erected, and Confederate leaders, many of whom had explicitly fought to preserve human bondage, were celebrated as icons of Southern pride. This myth was powerful. It allowed white Southerners to justify their continued oppression of black Americans, fueling segregation, voter suppression, and economic subjugation under Jim Crow laws. The Lost Cause reinforced the idea that black people had never been equal to whites, that Reconstruction had been a mistake, that the South had been ruined by federal intervention, and that it was now the duty of white leaders to restore order. And while the Ku Klux Klan had faded under federal pressure, its spirit remained alive in the brutality that followed. Lynchings became a grim ritual, a public spectacle meant to remind black communities that their existence was conditional. The white mobs that carried out these executions no longer needed hoods or secrecy. Their actions were not just tolerated, but often celebrated. seen as necessary to maintain the natural order of white dominance. The flames had died, but the embers still burned, waiting for the next resurgence of terror. Lynchings continue without the Klan's name, but with its spirit. The terror did not vanish when the Klan was forced into hiding. It simply evolved, spreading its influence beyond the organization itself, embedding its brutality into the fabric of daily life. Lynchings became the new symbol of white supremacy, the unspoken but widely accepted form of racial punishment, carried out in broad daylight, often in front of cheering crowds, treated not as crimes but as necessary rituals to maintain the so-called natural order. Without the structure of the Klan dictating the violence, mob rule took over, with white communities banding together to execute black men, women, and children with impunity. The victims were rarely criminals. Most were accused of nothing more than looking at a white woman the wrong way, speaking out against racism, attempting to vote, or simply existing with confidence in a world that refused to accept them as equals. The details of these lynchings were horrifying, but they were never meant to be secret. They were spectacles designed to send a message to every black person in America. You are not safe. Your rights are conditional. Your life belongs to the will of white men. The scenes were grotesque. Bodies hanged from trees for days, burned alive as crowds watched, mutilated beyond recognition, their remains left as warnings, displayed in postcards, published in newspapers as justified executions. Many lynchings were announced in advance, giving spectators time to arrive, creating a grotesque carnival atmosphere around the destruction of human life. And no one intervened. Local law enforcement refused to prosecute the killers. Politicians ignored the bloodshed. Federal officials looked the other way, treating the deaths not as crimes, but as traditions woven into the culture of the South. While the Klan had once operated in secrecy, lynchings required no hoods, no disguises, no hidden meetings in the dead of night. The perpetrators were often prominent members of society: business owners, sheriffs, judges, mayors. Men who were never questioned, never punished, never condemned. Newspapers published accounts that blamed the victims, framing lynchings not as senseless violence but as justice, a response to invented crimes, ensuring that white communities felt justified in their actions. The children who grew up watching these events learned that racial violence was acceptable, that black ambition should always be punished, that maintaining white dominance required bloodshed. And so, generation after generation, the cycle continued, leaving scars that stretched far beyond the bodies left hanging from trees. The silence surrounding these horrors was deafening. Lynchings were common knowledge, their details known to everyone who lived in the South. But America chose to look away. Northern politicians, eager to move beyond Reconstruction's failures, ignored pleas for federal action. White communities, unwilling to acknowledge the scale of the brutality, excused the killings as isolated incidents, dismissing them as the unfortunate consequences of racial tension. And even as reports circulated, even as photographs emerged, even as black activists risked their lives to demand justice, the nation refused to face the truth. The Klan may have faded, but its spirit remained, living on in the mobs, in the legal system, in the quiet approval of a country that preferred to forget rather than confront its own monstrosities. America forgets, or chooses not to see, the monsters still breathing beneath the surface. America had long since abandoned the pretense of true justice. It had stepped back from Reconstruction, choosing silence over accountability, denial over truth, comfort over confrontation. The horrors of lynchings, the suppression of black voters, the destruction of black communities. All were treated as unfortunate, but unavoidable aspects of Southern life, rather than the calculated and systemic oppression they truly were. The country moved forward, never truly reckoning with the blood it had allowed to soak into its soil, never fully acknowledging that its ideals of democracy and equality had been repeatedly betrayed. The monsters, the ideologies, the violence, the hatred were never slain. They were merely buried beneath a veneer of civility, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And that moment arrived not with political revival, nor with the resurgence of masked riders in the night, but through a far more insidious weapon: cinema. By the early 20th century, the South's lost cause mythology had grown into a fully accepted historical narrative, teaching generations that the Confederacy had been noble, that slavery had not been the foundation of its fight, that Reconstruction had been a national disaster rather than a moral necessity. White Americans, especially those far removed from the South's deep racial wounds, found comfort in these revisions, accepting them as fact. But mere revision was not enough to fully restore the grandeur of the past, not enough to reignite the flames of racial dominance. To do that, the Klan needed heroes again. It was not history books, not political speeches, not newspapers that rebranded the Klan as saviors of civilization. It was film. And it was done on a scale never seen before, through a medium that could reach further than any pamphlet, any sermon, any Southern rally could. The birth of American cinema was about to collide with the rebirth of the Klan, giving hatred a new, modern face, a spectacle so grand that it would reshape public perception of race and righteousness for decades to come. The Birth of a Nation, Klan reborn through film, 1950 D.W. Griffith's film The Birth of a Nation glorifies the Klan, turning them from villains into saviors, reigniting the fire of white supremacy on a national scale. The rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan did not come through secret meetings, darkened rooms, or masked riders galloping through southern towns. It came through the silver screen, through spectacle, through the most powerful form of propaganda the modern world had ever seen. By the early 20th century, cinema had emerged as a revolutionary medium, capable of reaching audiences across the country, imprinting images into minds with an intensity that newspapers, books, and political speeches never could. And no film would prove this more than D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, a sprawling, meticulously crafted cinematic epic that did not simply depict the Klan, but exalted it, transforming it from a forgotten remnant of Reconstruction era violence into an American symbol of righteousness, valor, and patriotism. The film's story was adapted from Thomas Dixon, Jeanta's novel and play The Klansman, which had been explicitly written to romanticize white supremacy and justify racial terror as a necessary defense against black political influence. Griffith, eager to craft the most ambitious film ever produced, seized on the opportunity to turn Dixon's vision into a sweeping visual masterpiece, pioneering cinematic techniques that would become foundational to the future of filmmaking. Close-ups, battle sequences, cross-cutting suspense, large-scale reenactments that immersed viewers in its grand revisionist history. But beneath its revolutionary filmmaking techniques lay a grotesque lie, one that would rewrite history, inflame racial tensions, and resurrect the Klan into its next and most devastating era. The Birth of a Nation did not merely present a distorted view of the Civil War and Reconstruction. It deliberately rewrote the past, portraying freedmen as dangerous, corrupt, incapable of governance, and inherently violent, while casting the Ku Klux Klan as the noble saviors of civilization. Black men were depicted as predatory, preying on white women, wielding unchecked political power, plunging the South into chaos, and the only force that could restore order. Peace, an American virtue, was the Klan. The film's climax, in which the hooded riders gallop to the rescue of white Southerners besieged by black legislators and criminals, was not just entertainment, it was a call to action, a visual argument that demanded racial hierarchy be defended at all costs. The impact was immediate and devastating. Audiences, many of whom had never witnessed such an immersive spectacle before, were swept into its narrative, emotionally invested in its portrayal of Reconstruction as a disaster, cheering as the Klan rode into battle to reclaim the South, mourning for the supposed greatness of the Confederacy lost to Northern intervention. Black activists protested furiously, recognizing the film as an incitement to racial violence, a tool that would embolden white mobs, reinforcing the belief that terror against black Americans was not only justified, but necessary for the survival of the nation itself. But their cries were drowned out by the sheer popularity of the film, which became a cultural phenomenon, celebrated by white audiences who saw it not as revisionist history, but as truth itself. And Griffith's vision would not simply remain confined to theatres. It would enter the halls of political power, welcomed into the highest office in the land, stamped with approval from the President of the United States himself. President Woodrow Wilson screens it at the White House. The screening of The Birth of a Nation at the White House was not just a cultural endorsement. It was a political statement, one that legitimized the film's glorification of white supremacy at the highest level of government. When President Woodrow Wilson, a historian by training and a man who had spent years shaping narratives of America's past, allowed the film to be shown within the halls of the Executive Mansion, he was not merely enjoying cinema. He was sanctioning its message. Wilson was known for his belief in the South's lost cosmythology, often expressing his view that Reconstruction had been a misstep, that Southern whites had suffered unfairly, that black political participation had led to chaos. When Griffith's film arrived, reinforcing every myth Wilson had long held about the post-war South, it was as if history itself had been rewritten to align with his worldview. Wilson's connection to the film ran deeper than just appreciation. His own writings were cited within its title cards, his scholarship used as justification for the Klan's role as defenders of American civilization. One infamous line, attributed to him, though its exact authorship remains debated, described Reconstruction as the era where black political influence had brought about veritable overthrow of civilization, painting freedmen as inherently incapable of governance, reinforcing the idea that only white leadership could restore order. The Birth of a Nation took this perspective and translated it into a grand cinematic spectacle, ensuring that the audience did not merely hear these claims in academic circles, but saw them play out in heroic imagery on the screen. The film's depiction of black men as violent aggressors and the Klan as noble saviors struck a chord with many white Americans, validating their fears, their biases, their desire to see racial hierarchy defended by any means necessary. The screening was a monumental event, sending a message far beyond Washington. It told America that the Klan was not a relic of the past, but an ideal worth remembering, worth celebrating, worth reviving. Within months, the film spread across the country, fueling a renewed interest in the Klan, awakening something dormant yet never truly dead. White audiences, many of whom had never personally witnessed the era of Reconstruction, absorbed Griffith's vision as truth. walking out of theaters with not just admiration, but purpose. That purpose found its first manifestation on the slopes of Stone Mountain in Georgia, where a preacher, inspired by the film's depiction of the Klan as righteous protectors of American values, took it upon himself to reignite the tradition of terror, to resurrect the imagery that had once terrorized freedmen, to reintroduce the most infamous symbol of Klan brutality. And so, on that cold November night in 1915, a cross was lit once again, its flames reaching into the sky. Its message unmistakable. The Ku Klux Klan had returned. Inspired by the film, a preacher relights a cross on Stone Mountain. The flickering flames of the cross on Stone Mountain were more than just a symbol. They were a declaration. Inspired by the birth of a nation, preacher William J. Simmons, a former Methodist minister and self-proclaimed defender of Southern values, stood before a gathering of white men on that cold November night in 1915, reigniting a tradition that had once terrorized the South. The original Klan had faded, scattered by federal intervention, its night rides suppressed, its members forced into hiding, but its legacy had never truly died. The myths of white supremacy still thrived, woven into laws, into segregated institutions, into the lost cause ideology that had rewritten history. And now, with Griffith's film reshaping public perception, the time had come to bring the Klan back, not as a fragmented relic of Reconstruction, but as a modernized force, one with far greater ambitions. The ceremony at Stone Mountain was designed to be dramatic, ritualistic, a spectacle meant to invoke both history and divine purpose. Standing beside his followers, Simmons held aloft a torch, its flames illuminating the darkness as the first modern burning cross took shape against the Georgia night sky. The act was powerful, unmistakable. It was a message to the South, to the country, to all those who believed that white supremacy had lost its grip on America. It was returning, stronger, bolder, untouchable. And unlike the secretive, disorganized Klan of the Reconstruction era, this new version was built to last. It would not simply exist in hidden circles. It would be a national movement, expanding beyond the South, infiltrating politics, law enforcement, industry, even religious organizations. It would recruit openly, appeal to middle-class white Americans, present itself not as a band of criminals, but as a moral crusade, a force dedicated to the restoration of traditional American values. Simmons understood that the power of the birth of a nation lay in its ability to transform the Klan's image, making it palatable to those who had once shunned its violent origins. This was no longer a group of disgruntled Confederate veterans. It was now a fraternal order, a patriotic organization, a defender of American purity. And so, with the fire blazing on Stone Mountain, the Ku Klux Klan was reborn. But this was not the Klan of the past. This was something far larger, far more structured, far more dangerous. The Klan is reborn with terrifying force, bigger, more organized, more powerful. The rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan was unlike anything seen before. It was no longer a loose collection of former Confederate soldiers clinging to a lost past. It was a vast, structured movement, woven into the very fabric of American society. With its resurgence in 1915, the Klan had transformed itself into an organized, disciplined, and far-reaching entity, one that would extend beyond its old southern strongholds, spreading its influence through cities, suburbs, churches, and political offices across the country. It was no longer an underground group. It was a national force, operating not just through fear, but through open recruitment, mass membership drives, and public displays of power. The Klan's revival was fueled by the birth of a nation, which had turned white, robed riders into mythic saviors, embedding the idea of the Klan as defenders of morality into the consciousness of white Americans who had never questioned their privilege. William J. Simmons, the man who lit the first burning cross at Stone Mountain, took full advantage of this newfound cultural legitimacy, launching a massive expansion effort that turned the Klan into a formalized organization with membership fees, initiation rituals, official hierarchy, and a carefully crafted public image. No longer a secretive band of vigilantes, the Klan marketed itself as a patriotic brotherhood, a fraternity of white Christian men committed to preserving American values against the perceived threats of modernization, immigration, and racial equality. The strategy worked. Hundreds of thousands joined, not just poor farmers or disgruntled ex-Confederates, but middle-class men, businessmen, city officials, and religious leaders. The Klan presented itself as a force for good, promising to uphold traditional morality and protect white communities from corruption and disorder. Its members no longer feared exposure. They wore their robes proudly in public parades, marched through major cities, and held rallies attended by thousands, reinforcing the idea that their cause was not extremist, but mainstream. But beneath the patriotic veneer, the Klan's terror remained unchanged. Lynchings, intimidation, economic boycotts, and political manipulation ensured that its grip on American society tightened with each passing year. The Klan's power expanded beyond its initial focus on suppressing black Americans. It now targeted Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and anyone deemed un-American, using fear and propaganda to shape public opinion, influence elections, and push policies that favored white Protestant dominance. The Golden Age of Hate. The Second Klan, 1925, now national, not just Southern. It targets not only black Americans, but Catholics, Jews, immigrants, expanding its reach into every corner of American life. The Second Ku Klux Klan did not rise in secrecy. It emerged in broad daylight, marching proudly through the streets of America, proclaiming itself not as a fringe terrorist group, but as a legitimate moral authority. Unlike its predecessor, which operated mainly in the South and focused exclusively on terrorizing freedmen, this new Klan expanded its reach, targeting anyone deemed un-American. The enemy was no longer just black Americans. It was Catholics, Jews, immigrants, socialists, and anyone who threatened white Protestant supremacy. The Klan styled itself as the guardian of traditional American values, appealing to the anxieties of white citizens who feared the rapid cultural and political shifts of the early 20th century. This Klan was organized, structured like a nationwide fraternity, complete with membership fees, leadership councils, and recruitment drives. It no longer needed to hide in the shadows. Its members wore their robes proudly, participating in parades, rallies, and political gatherings, presenting themselves not as extremists, but as defenders of America itself. The image of the hooded Klansman had changed. From feared night rider to respected community leader, infiltrating schools, businesses, churches, and government offices. Politicians courted Klan endorsements, preachers wove Klan ideology into sermons, newspapers reported on its activities without condemnation, treating its rise as a movement of patriotism rather than a resurgence of hate. The Klan's recruitment methods were highly effective, drawing in middle-class professionals, not just angry rural farmers, but educated men, business owners, law enforcement officers, and government officials. It promised not only brotherhood, but political influence, ensuring that its members would shape laws, control judicial rulings, and enforce white Protestant dominance from within the highest levels of power. By the mid-1920s, its numbers had swelled into the millions. making it one of the largest and most powerful organizations in America. Not just feared, but respected, embraced, and defended by those with real political control. Millions joined policemen, judges, governors, senators. The second Ku Klux Klan did not operate in secrecy. It ruled in plain sight, its influence stretching into every level of American society. By the early 1920s, millions had joined, embracing the organization not as an extremist group, but as a legitimate movement, a symbol of white Protestant dominance over the nation. The Klan had become a political force, infiltrating law enforcement, judicial offices, state governments, and even Congress itself. Governors, senators, and mayors openly embraced Klan endorsement, using its vast membership base to secure elections and shape policies that reinforced racial, religious, and social hierarchies. Police officers, judges, and prosecutors, the very men responsible for enforcing justice, were often Klan members themselves, ensuring that Black Americans, Catholics, Jews, and immigrants remained oppressed by the legal system, denied protection, falsely imprisoned, or ignored when faced with mob violence. The Klan did not merely operate outside the law. It became the law, crafting legislation that upheld segregation, restricting immigration from non-European nations, and suppressing Black political participation. Newspapers published editorials defending the Klan's mission. Churches incorporated Klan rhetoric into sermons, and businesses openly funded its activities, reinforcing its status not as a rogue organization, but as a pillar of American identity. With its unchecked rise, the Klan grew more emboldened, flaunting its power with massive public demonstrations designed to remind the nation that it was not just present. It was everywhere, and nothing captured its reach more than the unforgettable sight of thousands of hooded figures marching through the capital of the United States, their robes flowing, their flags waving, their torches flickering in the night. Klan parades marched down Washington, D.C., with flags and torches. The Ku Klux Klan had transformed, no longer a secretive band of masked vigilantes, no longer a collection of shadowy figures lurking in the night, but a force that marched boldly through the streets, unchallenged. Unashamed, undeniable, the Second Klan, reborn from the embers of the birth of a nation, had shed the need for secrecy, had abandoned the era of midnight raids hidden from view. Now, it stepped forward into daylight, claiming its place not as an underground movement, but as a dominant national institution. It was not just the South that embraced it. It was America itself. And nowhere was that clearer than in the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., the heart of the nation, the seat of democracy, became the stage for one of the most unsettling spectacles of white supremacy's resurgence. The year was 1925, and the Klan had reached the height of its power. With millions of members, with governors, senators, judges, and police officers within its ranks, it had embedded itself in the political and social structure of the country. And now, it sought to make that dominance visible, to prove that it had not just returned, but had triumphed. On that August afternoon, thousands of Klansmen descended upon the streets of Washington, their ranks orderly, their robes pristine, their faces unmasked. There was no shame, no secrecy. This was a victory march. The procession stretched for miles, an endless sea of white. Hooded figures carrying American flags, torches flickering in their hands, marching beneath the very buildings where laws were made, where leaders spoke of liberty, where the country claimed to stand for justice. They walked proudly, their boots hitting the pavement in rhythmic unity, their banners proclaiming their cause not as extremism, but as patriotism. It was not a protest, it was a proclamation. It told the world that the Klan was not a relic of the past, not a shameful memory of Reconstruction. It was alive, it was strong, it was woven into the nation itself. Bystanders watched from sidewalks, some in silent unease, others in open admiration, as the marchers paraded through the heart of American democracy, without opposition. And this was not just an isolated event. It was a symptom of a deeper reality, a sign that the Klan's influence had burrowed into the core of American politics, religion, and culture. White supremacy was no longer confined to the fringes, it had entered the mainstream. It had seats in legislative chambers. It dictated policies, it influenced elections, it whispered through pulpits and boardrooms alike. The burning crosses had been replaced by endorsements, by legislation, by carefully crafted speeches that did not use the name Klan, but carried its spirit nonetheless. And on that day in Washington, the nation watched as the Klan declared that it was no longer terror. It was mainstream. The Ku Klux Klan's transformation from an underground terror organization into a mainstream institution was not just a cultural shift. It was a triumph of propaganda, political manipulation, and financial strategy. By the 1920s, the Klan was no longer hiding in the shadows. It had embedded itself in American society, presenting itself as a respectable organization, a brotherhood dedicated to protecting American values. Politicians sought its endorsements. Churches incorporated its ideology into sermons. Law enforcement actively shielded its members. And middle-class families openly embraced its mission, believing that racial hierarchy, anti-immigrant sentiment, and religious exclusion were patriotic ideals rather than extremist beliefs. This mainstream acceptance allowed the Klan to build immense power, not just through fear, but through wealth. As its membership swelled into the millions, the organization became a financial empire, generating staggering sums of money through dues, fees, merchandise, elaborate ceremonies, and carefully crafted symbols of exclusivity. Every robe, every hood, every ritual carried a price. And Klan leaders capitalized on this fervor, turning their movement into an empire that could rival any fraternal order in the country. Membership was not simply about ideology, it was about status, and status had a cost. At the heart of the Klan's financial machine was a network of chapter fees, initiation costs, and endless opportunities for exploitation. Members were required to purchase their own official robes and regalia, often at heavily inflated prices set by Klan officials, ensuring that leadership saw massive profits from each new recruit. Meetings, ceremonies, and elaborate gatherings required donations, reinforcing a culture where Klan affiliation was not only ideological, but a financial investment. And while many joined for the promise of brotherhood and shared beliefs, the reality was clear. The Klan was a business, and its leaders were growing rich from the movement's meteoric rise. But power corrupts. And as the money poured in, Klan officials, many of whom had positioned themselves as moral crusaders, succumbed to scandal, greed, and self-interest, using the organization not as a means of social reform, but as a personal empire built on manipulation and deception. The very movement that claimed to uphold purity and traditional values was, behind closed doors, rife with financial fraud, backroom deals, and unchecked corruption. Behind the robes, money, power, and corruption, Klan leaders grow rich from dues, robes, and rituals, turning terror into profit, influence, and unchecked authority. Behind closed doors, the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s was not just a movement of terror. It was a financial empire, engineered by its leaders to amass staggering wealth from its millions of members. While ordinary recruits were drawn in by promises of patriotism, morality, and racial purity, the men at the top saw something far more valuable: an opportunity to exploit loyalty for profit. The Klan's resurgence had transformed it from a loosely organized band of vigilantes into a highly structured organization with a business model built on deception, greed, and unchecked corruption. Membership wasn't just ideological, it was a financial commitment, one that required dues, fees, official robes, ceremonial expenses, all carefully structured to pour money into the pockets of Klan leadership. The system was designed for maximum extraction. Initiates were required to pay hefty membership fees, which ensured a steady stream of revenue, while local and state leaders were expected to recruit aggressively, incentivized by kickbacks from new enrollments. The robes, hoods, and regalia, symbols of supposed purity and tradition, were sold at outrageous prices, ensuring that even the most devoted members contributed to the growing financial empire of the Klan's elite. Massive rallies, staged to reinforce the organization's dominance, were not just demonstrations, but profitable spectacles, with attendees paying for entrance, official merchandise, and participation in elaborate ceremonies meant to reinforce their loyalty while lining the pockets of leadership. At the top, Klan officials operated like corporate executives, securing lavish homes, controlling vast bank accounts, and manipulating their followers for personal gain. The moral crusade they claimed to lead was a farce, a carefully orchestrated lie designed to keep dues flowing to ensure that no member questioned where their money was truly going. Corruption was rampant, with leadership engaging in fraud, embezzlement, and financial mismanagement, using Klan funds to enrich themselves while presenting the organization as a righteous movement, defending American values. And with the Klan's deep ties to law enforcement, government offices, and business leaders, there were few consequences. The organization operated without scrutiny, protected by the very institutions it had infiltrated. With its financial success came political power, and politicians, recognizing the strength of the Klan's influence, eagerly aligned themselves with its agenda, riding its wave of terror and nationalism into office. Politicians ride the Klan's wave into office. Politicians who once viewed the Ku Klux Klan as a fringe organization now saw it as a political weapon, an unstoppable force capable of shaping elections, controlling policies, and securing victory for those who aligned themselves with its ideology. The Klan's membership had ballooned into the millions, stretching across the country, reaching not just small towns, but major cities, infiltrating courthouses, police departments, and legislative chambers. A candidate who sought office in certain states could not afford to ignore the Klan's influence. If he wished to win, he needed their backing, their votes, their financial support. And so, across the nation, governors, mayors, and senators aligned themselves with the organization, either in secret or in open embrace of its rhetoric. The Klan wielded immense power, threatening politicians who opposed them with smear campaigns, voter suppression, and outright intimidation. Meanwhile, those who cooperated were rewarded with loyal voting blocs, campaign donations, and political protection, ensuring that its influence did not merely shape local policies. It shaped the country's legislative direction. Laws were enacted to reinforce racial segregation, limit immigration from non-European nations, and suppress Catholic and Jewish communities, all under the guise of protecting American values. The Klan was no longer just a movement. It was a governing force, one that dictated who sat in office, who wrote laws, and who controlled the narrative of the nation's future. But as the organization reached its peak, greed began to rot the core from within. Leadership, once focused on expansion, became consumed by personal wealth, exploiting members for money, engaging in financial corruption, and using their influence not to further the clan's mission, but to enrich themselves at any cost. The empire they had built was strong, but cracks were beginning to show, and soon they would collapse under the weight of their own deception. At the height of its power, the Ku Klux Klan had embedded itself deep within the political, social, and economic fabric of America, shaping laws, steering elections, influencing judicial rulings, and dictating moral standards. It presented itself as an unassailable force, draped in purity, righteousness, and patriotic duty, convincing millions that its cause was not only justified, but essential to the survival of the nation. But behind the grand parades, the fiery rallies, and the public endorsements, the foundation of the Klan was rotting from within, consumed by greed, betrayal, and corruption. What had once been a movement built on ideological fanaticism had transformed into a lucrative business, with its leaders using membership fees, ceremonial sales, and influence peddling to amass staggering personal fortunes. The Klan's rapid expansion had been fueled by its ability to market itself as a necessary force, promising protection, moral leadership, and national unity. Millions of Americans bought into the vision, paying dues, purchasing official robes, attending massive gatherings, feeding money into an organization that thrived not just on fear, but on financial exploitation. Local chapters operated like franchises, with membership fees flowing upward, enriching state and national leadership, ensuring that those at the top held absolute control over the movement's wealth and direction. But with unchecked power came unchecked corruption, and the men who had positioned themselves as the guardians of American purity began to devour their own empire from within. Leaders pocketed vast sums, diverting funds meant for Klan initiatives into personal accounts, lavish homes, extravagant lifestyles. Many saw the organization not as a movement, but as a machine for wealth, a tool to elevate their own status at the expense of their followers. Initiation fees soared, hidden charges were introduced, and even the purchase of robes became an exercise in financial deception, as members were forced to buy overpriced materials, with a significant cut going to Klan leadership. The illusion of unity masked a growing fracture, as local chapters resented the greed of those above them, frustrated that their loyalty was being turned into profit rather than action. Worse still, as the Klan expanded beyond its original purpose, rivalries and betrayals emerged, with ambitious men seeking to seize control from within. Infighting spread like a disease. Accusations of theft, deception, and failed promises eroded the myth of moral leadership, shattering the illusion that the Klan stood for anything beyond self-preservation. As its grip tightened, whispers of scandal became impossible to silence, with internal disputes leaking into public view, tarnishing its reputation, exposing cracks in its carefully crafted image. Soon, the facade of purity was irreparably damaged, as one scandal after another shattered the illusion of moral supremacy, making it clear that the Klan's greatest enemy was not external opposition, but itself. Scandals and infighting cracked the illusion of purity. As the Ku Klux Klan reached its peak in the early 1920s, its leaders had convinced millions that the organization stood for moral righteousness, patriotic duty, and religious purity. It had embedded itself in every level of American life, influencing elections, controlling law enforcement, dictating social norms, and amassing extraordinary financial wealth. But beneath the pristine robes, beneath the fiery rhetoric of white supremacy and national unity, the movement was rotting from within. The Klan had built its empire on the illusion of unshakable integrity, its leaders presenting themselves as guardians of traditional American values, defenders of faith, law, and order. That illusion, however, was a carefully constructed lie, and as the decade progressed, it began to unravel piece by piece. The very men who had positioned themselves as moral crusaders were soon revealed to be nothing more than opportunists, frauds, criminals, and predators, exploiting their followers for financial gain, using their influence for personal indulgence, wielding their unchecked power not to protect communities, but to destroy lives for their own benefit. Whispers of scandal had been building for years. Embezzlement, corruption, bribery, hidden deals with politicians, fraudulent schemes designed to siphon money from local chapters into the pockets of national Klan leadership. Members who had devoted themselves to the movement began to see the cracks, realizing that their loyalty had been manipulated for profit, that their dues were not funding righteous causes, but lining the pockets of men who saw the Klan as nothing more than a money-making machine. But the true breaking point came when the veil of moral authority was shattered completely. When the Klan's most prominent leaders were exposed not just as thieves, but as monsters, their crimes far darker than financial fraud. Across the country, high-profile cases emerged detailing rape, murder, and acts of unthinkable brutality, committed by the very figures who had preached morality and virtue. One of the most devastating blows came in 1925, when David C. Stevenson, the Grand Dragon of the Indiana Klan, one of the most powerful figures in the movement, was arrested and convicted for the abduction, rape, and murder of Madge Oberholzer, a young woman he had brutally assaulted before leaving her to die. His trial, widely covered in newspapers across the nation, exposed the depths of Klan leadership's depravity, revealing not just his own violence, but the unchecked brutality rampant within the organization's ranks. The revelations sent shockwaves through America. The Klan, once seen as a pillar of virtue, was now unmasked as a den of corruption, greed, and sadism. More scandals followed. Klan officials charged with embezzlement, tax fraud, violent assaults. Klan-backed politicians exposed for using their power to cover up crimes, suppress investigations, and shield criminals. The organization's once loyal followers began to abandon it, unable to reconcile their faith in its ideals with the grotesque realities now flooding newspaper headlines. By the late 1920s, the Klan's grip on America was slipping, its leaders falling, its influence crumbling, its reputation beyond repair. The empire built on fear was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own deception. The crumble, public exposure and decline, late 1920s high-profile cases of rape, murder, and fraud reveal the Klan's brutality, corruption, and the lie that had held it together for so long. The unraveling of the Ku Klux Klan's empire in the late 1920s was not simply the result of internal corruption. It was a reckoning, a moment, when the mask of righteousness the Klan had worn so carefully began to fall, exposing the brutality, greed, and deception that had festered beneath its robes for years. The organization had spent the better part of the decade cultivating an image of purity, morality, and patriotism, embedding itself into every level of society: politics, law enforcement, religious institutions, presenting itself not as an extremist force, but as a protector of American values. But as the high-profile cases of rape, murder, and fraud piled up, the illusion of the Klan as a noble movement became impossible to maintain. The scandals that emerged in state after state cracked its foundation, revealing to the public what had long been whispered behind closed doors: that the Klan was not a brotherhood, not a force of virtue, but a machine of corruption, violence, and unbridled power. David C. Stevenson's trial had set the stage for the Klan's downfall, revealing the monstrous reality behind its leadership. A movement that claimed to uphold moral purity was run by men who operated with impunity, who used their power to cover up atrocities, to silence victims, to shield predators from justice. And Stevenson was far from alone. His trial was a gateway into a deeper truth, as more cases surfaced detailing embezzlement, bribery, violent assaults, and secret dealings between Klan officials and politicians who had once championed the organization. The Klan's grip on America had always depended on secrecy, on controlling the narrative, on ensuring that outsiders never saw beyond the carefully staged rallies, the grand parades, the fiery speeches declaring its mission as one of national salvation. But now, that narrative was beginning to collapse, dismantled by the weight of its own exposed crimes. Public trust in the organization began to wane, as citizens who had once viewed the Klan as a pillar of American virtue now questioned its legitimacy. Churches that had once aligned themselves with its cause distanced themselves. Businesses that had funded its events withdrew their support. Politicians who had ridden the wave of its influence abandoned it to save their own careers. The loyalty that had held the Klan together for years, rooted in fear, in belief in manipulation, was now fracturing, with members either fleeing in disillusionment or turning against their former allies to protect themselves. And the final blow came not from law enforcement or government intervention, but from the power of exposure itself. Journalists, whistleblowers, and investigative writers began peeling away the hooded lies, publishing reports that laid bare the horrors hidden within the Klan's ranks. The secrecy that had once shielded the organization was now its downfall, as newspapers ran exposés on Klan crimes, detailing the financial schemes, the political betrayals, the violence long ignored by officials. The American public, no longer blinded by propaganda, began to see the truth, that the Klan was not a force of righteousness, but a stain upon the country, a movement built on deception and terror, one whose downfall was long overdue. Journalists and whistleblowers begin to peel away the hooded lies. As investigative journalists began to rip away the layers of deception, the Ku Klux Klan's empire, built on secrecy, financial manipulation, and political influence, started to crumble under the weight of undeniable truth. For years, the organization had carefully crafted an image of moral purity, presenting itself as a patriotic brotherhood, a force for American virtue, a defender of tradition against the so-called threats of modernity. But now, the curtain had been drawn back, revealing the monstrous reality within. Newspapers across the country published exposés on Klan corruption, detailing its fraudulent financial schemes, its abuse of political power, and its network of violence, intimidation, and unchecked criminality. Journalists uncovered embezzlement operations within Klan leadership, exposing how millions of dollars, collected from eager recruits who believed they were funding a righteous cause, had been siphoned into the personal accounts of Klan officials, financing extravagant lifestyles, hidden estates, and private ventures. Reports detailed how Klan-backed politicians had engaged in illegal dealings, using their influence to protect criminals within the organization, ensuring that justice never reached the guilty. Even local police departments, once thought to be impartial enforcers of the law, were revealed to be deeply complicit, using their positions not to maintain order, but to suppress evidence and shield Klan members from prosecution. Whistleblowers, former Klansmen who had once been loyal to the organization, began to step forward, their testimonies exposing the true depths of Klan leadership's hypocrisy. Some revealed how members had been forced into blind obedience, threatened with violence or financial ruin if they dared question authority. Others detailed the scale of internal corruption, describing how the movement's expansion had been fueled not by ideological commitment, but by greed, with leaders prioritizing membership fees over actual action. The testimonies were damning, further unraveling the illusion of unity that had kept the Klan's empire intact for so long. The public could no longer ignore the truth. The headlines were unavoidable, the details too grotesque to dismiss. Disillusionment swept through Klan ranks, as once loyal members abandoned their robes, realizing that they had been nothing more than pawns in a massive scheme of exploitation and control. The organization's credibility collapsed, as citizens who had once embraced its message now saw it for what it truly was: a hollow, corrupt institution built on lies, sustained by fear, destined to fall under the weight of its own deception. And so, membership plummeted. Recruits stopped pouring in, financial support dwindled, and the empire that had once commanded millions began to disintegrate, its influence fading, its grip weakening, its reputation irreparably tarnished. The mighty organization that had once terrorized the nation had collapsed again. Membership plummets. The empire collapses again. The fall of the Ku Klux Klan in the late 1920s was swift and brutal. What had once been a monstrous force embedded in American society, openly influencing elections, policing, religious institutions, and local governments, had now been exposed for what it truly was: a machine of corruption, greed, and unchecked brutality. The scandals that tore through the organization had shattered its credibility, forcing many former members to distance themselves, abandoning their robes, severing ties, and pretending they had never been part of the movement to begin with. Financial ruin struck the Klan from within, as membership fees dwindled, fundraising collapsed, and the once mighty empire of terror crumbled beneath its own excesses. State after state dismantled Klan-backed organizations. Law enforcement officials who had once shielded Klansmen from prosecution suddenly faced their own investigations. And politicians who had previously embraced Klan endorsements rushed to erase any trace of their affiliations, fearful that their own careers would be destroyed if they were linked to a dying movement. The Klan's most powerful men, once untouchable, once feared, now found themselves abandoned, disgraced, and, in some cases, imprisoned. The organization that had once inspired millions to march proudly through the streets was now shrinking, its numbers reduced to a fraction of their former strength. By the early 1930s, it seemed as if the Klan had finally been buried, defeated not by military force or federal law, but by its own internal failures. But history had proven that the Klan never truly disappeared. It only retreated, waiting, watching, biding its time until the right moment arrived for resurgence. And so, as the Great Depression swept across the country, as America struggled to rebuild itself in the aftermath of economic collapse, the remnants of the Klan lurched into the background, wounded but never truly gone. The sleeping beast, the Klan between the wars, 1930s-1950s, the Great Depression and WWI, pushed the Klan into the background, silencing its open presence, but never fully extinguishing its fire. The fall of the Ku Klux Klan in the late 1920s had left its empire fractured, its reputation destroyed, its influence severely weakened. But history had shown time and again that the Klan was never truly eradicated. It merely retreated into the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity to resurface. As America plunged into the Great Depression, Economic devastation reshaped the country, forcing many Klan chapters into inactivity as financial hardship consumed former members who had once proudly marched in its ranks. Klan leaders who had thrived on membership dues and political manipulation watched their financial empire collapse, unable to sustain the organization's reach in an era when poverty gripped the nation. And yet, the ideology that fueled the Klan, the foundation of racial supremacy, the deep-seated fear of societal change, the belief in white Protestant dominance, did not disappear. Instead, it embedded itself within communities, its remnants surviving in whispers, in unspoken alliances, in the quiet persistence of segregation, discrimination, and systemic oppression. The Klan no longer dominated public life, no longer held massive parades in Washington, no longer openly dictated elections, but its spirit remained, buried within the institutions it had long influenced. World War II would further push the Klan into obscurity as American patriotism shifted toward a global fight against fascism and tyranny, forcing even the most ardent white supremacists to reckon with the contradictions between their ideology and America's supposed commitment to democracy. The war effort, which saw black soldiers serving their country abroad, only intensified the contradictions, making it harder for white supremacists to openly declare their superiority while black men and women fought and died for the very nation that oppressed them. Many Klan chapters collapsed under the weight of irrelevance, unable to justify their existence in a world consumed by larger battles. But even as the organization faded from the public eye, its remnants remained, simmering quietly, keeping the fires of racism alive, not in grand displays of terror, but in the slow, methodical reinforcement of segregation, in the silent refusal to acknowledge black equality, in the systemic barriers that ensured white dominance remained intact, even without hoods and burning crosses. Some remnants remain, simmering quietly, keeping the fires of racism alive, even as the Ku Klux Klan retreated from public dominance in the 1930s and 1940s. The forces that had sustained its terror did not simply vanish. White supremacy had been woven into the foundation of American institutions for centuries. It was not dependent on parades or fiery cross burnings to remain alive. The Klan's influence, though weakened, continued to seep through the cracks of society, shaping laws, reinforcing segregation, and ensuring that systemic oppression remained firmly in place. Even without official Klan rallies dominating headlines, its spirit lingered in the unspoken alliances among lawmakers, the quiet persistence of racial hierarchies, and the deliberate efforts to erase the progress black Americans had fought for during Reconstruction and beyond. The Klan had faded from the spotlight, but the ideology that had sustained it continued to thrive, patiently awaiting its next resurgence. Jim Crow laws ensured that segregation remained a brutal reality, restricting black Americans from voting, owning property in certain neighborhoods, or accessing the same schools, businesses, and transportation as their white counterparts. Redlining policies kept black families trapped in cycles of economic exclusion, denying them loans, preventing them from securing land, and reinforcing their second-class status. Though the Klan was no longer needed as an overt enforcer of racial oppression, its vision of a white-dominated America was being maintained through bureaucracy, legal loopholes, and quiet but forceful societal rejection. And while the Klan was struggling to maintain relevance, its methods of intimidation were finding new homes in other extremist movements, adapted by groups that saw its tactics as useful, as necessary to preserve their own visions of purity and dominance. By the time World War II erupted, Fascist ideologies had begun to creep into American political discourse, inspired by the rise of Nazi Germany and its own brand of racial supremacy. Some white supremacists, those who had once worn Klan robes, found new purpose in supporting Nazi ideals, believing that Hitler's vision for a racially pure society mirrored their own efforts in America. Pro-Nazi groups formed, spreading anti-Semitic propaganda, calling for racial segregation beyond black and white relations, and using Klan-inspired terror to intimidate Jewish communities, immigrants, and those who opposed fascism. Meanwhile, as the war ended and the global conversation shifted toward human rights, equality, and Reconstruction, segregationists in America feared that their power was slipping, that the tide was turning against white control. They saw the post-war world as a threat to their supremacy, especially as black soldiers returned from battlefields overseas, having fought for the very freedom that was denied to them at home. Southern politicians and white supremacist leaders scrambled to hold the line, using Klan-style terror, not through official organization, but through unofficial alliances, intimidation campaigns, and the strategic enforcement of racist policies. Nazi sympathizers and segregationists find new uses for Klan-style terror, even as the Ku Klux Klan receded from its former prominence in the early 20th century. Its tactics, intimidation, racial terror, and violent suppression were far from obsolete. Segregationists who feared the growing calls for racial equality, especially in the wake of World War II, found new ways to wield Klan-style terror, ensuring that the structures of white supremacy remained intact even without the official presence of the Klan itself. While the Klan had diminished in numbers, its ideology remained deeply embedded in American institutions, influencing local governments, police departments, and vigilante groups who sought to maintain the racial hierarchy through brutality and fear. Nazi sympathizers, emboldened by the racial doctrines of Hitler's Germany, saw value in the methods perfected by the Klan, incorporating its intimidation tactics into broader campaigns against Black Americans, Jewish communities, and immigrants. Though the US had fought against fascism in Europe, racist and extremist groups at home quietly adapted Nazi propaganda, blending it with the old traditions of the Klan: cross burnings, mob violence, lynchings carried out not in secret, but with full community complicity. The rise of anti-Semitic organizations echoed the racial hatred that had defined the Klan, using similar fear-mongering strategies to justify their actions, often operating within the same southern towns that had once been Klan strongholds. Meanwhile, segregationists across the South recognized that legal barriers alone would not be enough to suppress black activism. They needed terror, intimidation, and the kind of unchecked violence that had long defined the Klan's reign. Governors, police chiefs, and city officials, while publicly distancing themselves from the Klan's violent history, quietly encouraged vigilante enforcement of Jim Crow laws, ensuring that those who dared challenge segregation faced consequences that went far beyond legal punishment. Bombings of black homes and churches, attacks on civil rights workers, coordinated efforts to silence voices demanding change. These were acts carried out not by hooded riders, but by men in suits, men in uniform, men who held positions of power and used those positions to enforce terror without accountability. The tactics worked. For a time, black activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens faced relentless persecution, their homes targeted, their families threatened, their communities held in constant fear. But history had already proven that terror alone could not permanently suppress the fight for equality. By the 1950s, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, the resistance against segregation intensified, pushing America toward a reckoning it had long avoided. And as Black Americans rose to demand their rights, marching, protesting, risking their lives for justice, the Klan, sensing its grip slipping, reawakened with fire and fury. Fire and fury. The Klan returns during the Civil Rights eras, 1950s-1960s, as Black Americans rise to demand civil rights. The Klan reawakens, determined to fight progress with blood, terror, and brutality. The Civil Rights Movement was a direct challenge to the Klan's deepest fears, a movement that threatened to dismantle everything it had fought to preserve: segregation, racial hierarchy, and the forced subjugation of Black Americans. By the 1950s, the country had reached a turning point, and Black activists, leaders, and ordinary citizens refused to remain silent, demanding justice, marching through streets, standing before legislative bodies, risking their lives for the promise of true equality. For the Ku Klux Klan, which had remained simmering beneath the surface, surviving through quiet alliances and unspoken complicity, this resurgence of Black resistance signaled the need to awaken, to fight, to reassert dominance, to return to terror as its weapon of choice. The Klan's rebirth during the Civil Rights era was a reactionary explosion of violence, an attempt to crush the movement before it could gain unstoppable momentum. The organization's membership re-expanded, recruiting not only in the South, but across the country, calling upon white citizens who feared integration, who resented desegregation rulings, who saw the rising voices of Black Americans as a threat to their supremacy. Southern politicians, while publicly condemning violence, privately enabled it, refusing to prosecute Klan attacks, ensuring that police forces looked the other way when activists were assaulted, churches burned, and neighborhoods terrorized. But now, the Klan was not just targeting individuals, it was waging war on the movement itself. Freedom Riders were ambushed, their buses set ablaze. Black churches, the heart of civil rights organizing, were bombed in broad daylight, their congregations devastated. Lynchings returned, not in secrecy but with public brutality, meant to remind Black communities that their defiance would be met with bloodshed. Medgar Evers, a fierce advocate for desegregation, was assassinated in his own driveway, his murderer shielded by a system unwilling to convict him. The 4 little girls of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham were murdered by Klan members seeking to destroy the symbol of Black faith and resistance. The movement's leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., were constantly threatened, their homes targeted, their families forced to live under the spectre of imminent attack. The Klan had returned with fire and fury, determined to reassert its control through brutality, through devastation, through destruction. Bombings, lynchings, church burnings, terror reasserts itself violently. The Ku Klux Klan's reawakening during the Civil Rights Movement was a brutal attempt to reassert white supremacy through sheer terror, aimed at dismantling the growing resistance of Black Americans who refused to accept segregation any longer. With the rise of protests, boycotts, and legislative challenges to Jim Crow, the Klan responded with bloodshed, unleashing a wave of violence intended to silence activists, crush movements, and remind Black communities that their fight for equality would be met with the same brutality that had defined the Klan's reign decades before. The Klan's methods of terror returned with horrifying precision. Bombings, lynchings, church burnings, assassinations. Activists and organizers were hunted, their homes targeted, their families threatened. Bombs were placed beneath houses where civil rights discussions were taking place, aimed not at soldiers or political leaders, but at ordinary men, women, and children whose only crime was demanding justice. Black churches, the heart of the movement, the place where communities gathered for strength and resistance, became primary targets. Their walls shattered, their congregations devastated by explosions meant to instill fear. The violence was calculated, meant to send a message that the fight for civil rights was not just a political struggle. It was a war, and the Klan would stop at nothing to win. But despite the bloodshed, despite the horror, the movement did not stop. Activists, freedom fighters, black families who had endured generations of oppression, refused to be silenced, pressing forward. Marching through streets where Klansmen lurked, stepping into polling stations where they were unwelcome, continuing to demand their dignity despite the terror surrounding them. And the more they pushed forward, the more the Klan lashed out, desperate to claw back its control, resorting to its most horrifying weapon: murder. The killing of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy accused of speaking to a white woman, became one of the most infamous tragedies of the era, exposing the raw brutality of racial hatred to the entire nation. His body was found mutilated, beaten beyond recognition, dumped in the Tallahatchie River, his killers smiling in court, confident that they would never face true justice. His mother, refusing to let the world turn away, chose an open casket, forcing America to confront the reality of racism it had long ignored. Then came the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, where 4 little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair, were killed in an explosion planted by Klansmen. Their young lives erased in an act of pure hatred meant to strike fear into the heart of the movement. Their deaths ignited national outrage, but their killers would walk free for years, shielded by a system unwilling to hold white supremacists accountable. The murder of Emmett Till, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. The Klan's terror had returned in full force, but it had also exposed its own evil to the world, and the tide was beginning to turn. The murder of Emmett Till and the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church were 2 of the most horrifying and defining moments of racial terror during the civil rights era. Acts of violence meant to remind Black Americans that their pursuit of justice and equality would be met with bloodshed. But these atrocities did more than instill fear. They exposed the deep rot within the American judicial system, the inescapable reality that, despite overwhelming evidence, white supremacists rarely faced true consequences for their crimes. When Emmett Till's killers, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, were arrested and put on trial, the nation watched with anticipation. Surely, with the photographic evidence of Till's mutilated body, with the testimony of witnesses, with the undeniable cruelty of their actions, justice would finally be served. But the all-white jury in Mississippi had no intention of holding them accountable, delivering a not guilty verdict despite the overwhelming proof of their guilt. Months later, Bryant and Milam confessed to the murder in a paid interview, smug in the knowledge that double jeopardy laws protected them from being retried. Their crime had been brutal, deliberate, and well documented, and yet they walked free, leaving Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, to carry the weight of her son's death without the closure of true justice. The same grotesque miscarriage of justice occurred with the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, where Klansmen Robert Chambliss, Thomas Blunt and Herman Cash, and Bobby Frank Cherry planted explosives beneath the church and murdered 4 young black girls: Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair, in one of the deadliest attacks on the movement. The bombing sent shockwaves through the country, But in the immediate aftermath, authorities in Alabama refused to prosecute the killers, downplaying the attack, delaying investigations, and ensuring that no one faced trial. Despite overwhelming evidence linking Chambliss and the others to the crime, justice was withheld for years, with the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, suppressing critical information about their involvement. It wasn't until nearly 2 decades later that Chambliss was finally convicted, and even then, others involved remained free, protected by a legal system that saw their actions not as terrorism, but as the enforcement of white dominance. This pattern repeated itself across the South. Lynchings, bombings, assassinations, and violent beatings, all committed by Klansmen who, when arrested, were exonerated by juries of their white peers. Justice was not blind. It was deliberately obstructed, ensuring that those who terrorized black communities faced little to no consequences. No matter how horrifying the crime, no matter how undeniable the evidence, the system bent in favor of the oppressors, reinforcing the message that white supremacy was not just a cultural ideology, but a legally protected force. Klan members walk free as juries looked the other way. The Ku Klux Klan had thrived under the protection of a legal system designed to shield white supremacy, allowing its members to walk free despite overwhelming evidence of their crimes. Across the South, cases of murder, bombings, and lynchings ended in acquittals, not because the defendants were innocent, but because all white juries refused to convict them. Prosecutors deliberately suppressed evidence, judges threw out critical testimonies, and local police forces acted as accomplices rather than enforcers of justice. The cycle was exhaustingly predictable. A black victim, a white murderer, a courtroom charade, followed by a smug defendant walking free. Public outrage was growing. The civil rights movement had shattered the silence, and the undeniable brutality of the Klan's resurgence was now being broadcast across the country. The murder of Emmett Till, the bombing of black churches, the assassinations of civil rights leaders. Each act of terror was no longer buried in local newspapers or quietly ignored by white communities. The nation was watching, and with each acquittal, pressure built for federal intervention. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, had long been hesitant to take direct action against the Klan, preferring to focus its intelligence efforts on black activists and leftist groups rather than white supremacists. But as Klan violence intensified, Hoover was forced to acknowledge that the organization posed a national security threat. And so, the FBI launched a secret operation, COINTELPRO, designed to infiltrate, sabotage, and dismantle the Klan from within. Under COINTELPRO, federal agents went undercover, posing as recruits, attending meetings, gathering intelligence, and leaking details of Klan operations to disrupt their coordination. Informants were placed in local Klan chapters, exposing leaders who had previously operated without fear of surveillance. Wiretaps and surveillance operations revealed connections between Klan members and local law enforcement, proving what black communities had known for decades: that police officers were often directly involved in Klan activities. The operation was far from perfect. Hoover's FBI was still deeply prejudiced, often prioritizing efforts to weaken black radical movements like the Black Panther Party over truly dismantling white supremacist groups. But the infiltration inflicted real damage. Klan factions turned on one another, paranoid that their ranks had been compromised. Leadership began to fracture, unable to trust its own members. The once mighty organization was now tainted with paranoia and internal suspicion, unable to coordinate terror with the same unchecked freedom it once enjoyed. Meanwhile, The broader public was no longer willing to accept Klan violence as a distant Southern problem. News reports, televised documentaries, and first-hand accounts forced white Americans outside the South to confront the horrors they had ignored for so long. The Klan's reputation, once shielded by Southern pride and political alliances, was now crumbling under the weight of national scrutiny. Eyes of the nation, FBI infiltration and public shame, 1960s-1970s. The FBI's Kuantalpa infiltrates the Klan, sowing distrust within its ranks, while national exposure erodes its public influence. The FBI's infiltration of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1960s marked a significant shift. For the first time, federal agents actively worked to dismantle the organization from the inside, targeting its leadership, disrupting its operations, and exposing its crimes to the public. The civil rights movement had forced America to confront the reality of racial terror, and as the Klan continued its violent resistance, the federal government, long reluctant to interfere, could no longer justify its silence. Under the guise of national security, J. Edgar Hoover's Kuantalpa's counterintelligence program was deployed, embedding undercover agents deep within Klan networks, gathering intelligence on planned assassinations, bombings, and coordinated attacks against civil rights activists. Kuantalpa's approach was ruthless and systematic. Federal agents posed as loyal Klansmen, attending meetings, gaining trust, and climbing the ranks of the organization, slowly feeding critical information back to investigators. Wiretaps were placed in Klan strongholds, revealing not only explicit plans for acts of terror, but also the deep connections between Klan leadership and local law enforcement, state officials, and politicians who had spent years shielding them from scrutiny. The FBI documented how police officers were actively involved in Klan violence, how Southern judges deliberately obstructed justice in cases involving white supremacist defendants, how governors ensured that investigations into Klan attacks were delayed or dismissed entirely. The depth of institutional complicity was staggering, proving what black communities had always known, that the law had never truly protected them. But beyond intelligence gathering, Kuantalpa sought to destabilize the Klan from within, spreading paranoia among its ranks, fueling distrust between members, and orchestrating internal conflicts that weakened its structure. Agents leaked false information to Klan leaders, suggesting betrayals and undercover plots, turning high-ranking members against one another. Infighting erupted, accusations of disloyalty spread, and the once organized system of terror began to fracture under the weight of internal suspicion. Some factions, convinced that their leadership had been compromised, split from the main organization, further weakening its grip on nationwide operations. Meanwhile, public exposure of Klan plots fueled national outrage, as newspapers published damning reports detailing how Klan members were actively coordinating assassinations, church bombings, and the targeted killings of black activists and political figures. The organization had long relied on secrecy, thriving in the shadows of local governance, protected by a network of silent allies. But now, its crimes were being broadcast for all to see, shattering any remaining illusion that the Klan was merely a fraternal order, defending Southern heritage. The tide was turning, and even some of its former political allies began publicly condemning its actions, distancing themselves from an organization that had become too visible, too exposed, too dangerous to protect. But the most damning revelations came from the undercover agents themselves, who successfully exposed Klan plots of terror and assassination, revealing that high-ranking members were actively planning coordinated killings of civil rights leaders. judges who ruled in favor of desegregation, and black organizers responsible for voter registration drives. The full extent of the Klan's murderous ambitions shocked the country, laying bare the terrifying reality that these plots had been in motion for years, protected by legal institutions too corrupt or too indifferent to intervene. Undercover agents exposed plots of terror and assassination. The Klan's crimes were no longer secret. They were laid bare for the nation to see, and the consequences were about to change everything undercover agents embedded within Ku Klux Klan chapters exposed not only the organization's tactics, but its darkest ambitions. Murder, terror, and coordinated assassinations of civil rights leaders, journalists, and federal officials who threatened its power. For years, these plots had thrived under the protection of local law enforcement and sympathetic politicians, shielded from investigation, dismissed as rumors rather than imminent threats. But as the FBI's COINTELPRO infiltrated deeper into Klan operations, their secret conversations, their planned killings, their hidden alliances were documented in painful detail, laying bare the reality that these were not isolated crimes, but systematic efforts to eliminate opposition and silence progress. The revelations ignited a wave of federal intervention, finally forcing long overdue trials against Klansmen who had previously walked free. Murder cases long ignored were reopened. Bombings once brushed aside as accidents were reclassified as domestic terrorism. And prosecutors, some reluctantly, began to pursue convictions against those who had evaded justice for decades. The trial of Byron Della Beckwith, charged with the assassination of Medgar Evers, finally led to his conviction, over 30 years after his crime. The trial of Bobby Frank Cherry, involved in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, resulted in his conviction, decades after the deaths of 4 little girls. One by one, men who had once boasted of their immunity were finally held accountable, albeit far later than justice should have demanded. Meanwhile, documentaries, investigative reports, and televised discussions exposed Klan brutality to a new generation, ensuring that the horrors of racial terrorism could not be forgotten. Films and in-depth journalism laid bare the full history of the Klan's reign, tracing its terror from Reconstruction through the civil rights era, forcing Americans, many of whom had looked away, to confront the blood-soaked legacy of white supremacy. And slowly, public opinion began to shift as the undeniable evidence of Klan violence overwhelmed years of propaganda, denial, and silence. Trials, convictions, documentaries begin to shift public opinion. The Klan, once seen as untouchable, was now exposed in courtroom proceedings and public discourse, and its grip on America began to slip. As trials, convictions, and documentaries began to reshape America's understanding of the Ku Klux Klan, the organization's once unshakable grip on society started to weaken. The legal victories of the civil rights movement had forced the Klan into an era of reckoning, where its unchecked violence could no longer escape scrutiny, where its members could no longer rely on legal protection or public indifference to shield them from accountability. Courtrooms that had once dismissed cases against Klansmen now held them to answer for decades of bloodshed. And although justice had arrived late for many, it had arrived nonetheless. But the Klan's decline did not mean the end of white supremacy, and though its membership numbers fell, its ideology did not vanish, it simply adapted. Some former Klansmen, fearing public exposure, unwilling to risk legal consequences, or recognizing that the Klan's power was fading, chose not to fight the shift, but to blend in, removing their hoods, retreating into ordinary society. They were not reformed. They were not repentant. They were merely adjusting to the new landscape, finding new ways to channel their hatred and influence without the baggage of a Klan robe. White supremacists who had once proudly marched under the Klan banner began integrating into mainstream politics, law enforcement, and emerging nationalist movements, ensuring that their beliefs lived on without the overt symbolism of the past. Many joined far-right organizations, anti-immigrant coalitions, or fundamentalist groups, shifting their rhetoric from explicit racial terror to coded language about traditional values, state sovereignty, and law and order. Phrases that veiled their continued commitment to racial hierarchy. Others infiltrated police forces, ensuring that systemic racism remained not through illegal vigilante terror, but through institutional policies that disproportionately targeted black communities. The same individuals who had once burned crosses now wrote discriminatory policies, enforced oppressive laws, and maintained economic barriers that kept racial inequality alive. They did not need a Klan robe anymore. Their power was woven into the system itself. And in political spheres, former Klansmen quietly transitioned into public office, presenting themselves as defenders of conservative values, carefully shaping legislation that reinforced segregationist ideals, even as the country officially moved past Jim Crow. They adapted, disguising their past, erasing records of their former affiliations, ensuring that their influence survived beyond the Klan's fall. The official Klan was shrinking, but white supremacy was not. But many Klan members simply removed their hoods and joined other movements. Even as the Ku Klux Klan's public influence declined in the later decades of the 20th century, many of its members did not abandon their ideology. They simply adapted, shifting their methods, disguising their affiliations, and embedding themselves in movements that carried white supremacist ideals under new banners. The Klan was no longer the dominant force of racial terror that had defined the Reconstruction era or the civil rights movement, but its members found new pathways to spread their influence. Some former Klansmen joined far-right paramilitary groups, aligning themselves with rising anti-government movements that claimed to fight for patriotism while reinforcing racial hierarchies. Others became influential figures in fundamentalist organizations, weaving white nationalist rhetoric into religious doctrine, using faith as a shield to justify segregationist beliefs. As mainstream politics increasingly rejected overt Klan symbolism, many white supremacists rebranded their presence, forming hate groups that abandoned the robes and rituals but retained the same ideology of exclusion and oppression. Meanwhile, the infiltration of law enforcement and political institutions continued, as former Klan members sought positions where their influence could reshape laws, policies, and community structures without openly declaring their allegiance to white supremacy. The era of public Klan parades had ended, but the fight to preserve racial dominance had simply evolved, taking on forms that were harder to immediately recognize, but just as insidious. By the late 20th century, the Klan was no longer the dominant face of racial extremism. Its influence had fractured into smaller factions. Its ideology spread into movements that avoided direct association while promoting the same principles. Hate had adapted. It had changed masks, rebranded itself, and found new avenues to survive. A changing mask. The Klan in the modern era, 1980s, 2000s. The robes fade, but hate adapts, morphing into new groups, political strategies, and coded rhetoric that continue the legacy of exclusion and oppression. As the Ku Klux Klan's visibility declined in the late 20th century, its ideology did not disappear. It simply evolved, integrating itself into new movements, new symbols, new networks designed to spread racial hatred in subtler, more insidious ways. The Klan had spent decades dominating the narrative of American white supremacy, but by the 1980s and 1990s, its structure was no longer the primary driving force behind racial extremism. The robes faded. The elaborate rituals became relics of an earlier time, but the Klan's fundamental beliefs merged with the rising tides of far-right extremism, creating a new generation of white nationalist movements that carried forward the same message under different names. One of the first major shifts was the rise of skinhead culture, which combined elements of white supremacy with punk aesthetics, street violence, and militarized aggression. Unlike the robed, secretive Klan of decades past, white power skinheads operated openly, recruiting members in working-class neighborhoods, aligning themselves with neo-Nazi organizations, and spreading their ideology through music, gang affiliations, and underground networks. Hate was now branded in symbols rather than ceremonies, with swastikas, Confederate flags, and coded tattoos replacing the burning crosses of the past. At the same time, militia movements flourished, fueled by fears of government control, immigration, and racial integration. These groups often marketed themselves as patriot organizations, claiming allegiance to American values while quietly reinforcing white supremacist ideals. Many former Klansmen joined these militia networks, abandoning traditional Klan imagery while promoting anti-immigrant, anti-black, and anti-Semitic narratives under the guise of protecting freedom and traditional values. The Klan, in essence, had adapted to the new landscape, recognizing that hate could be repackaged, hidden beneath political slogans, and embedded within movements that distanced themselves from its historical baggage. Then came the internet. The rise of online forums changed everything, giving extremists a platform unrestricted by geography, law enforcement, or mainstream accountability. White supremacy, which had once required local meetings and physical recruitment efforts, was now global, spreading through anonymous message boards, encrypted chat rooms, and propaganda websites that rebranded Klan ideology for a digital generation. The hate that had once relied on physical intimidation was now weaponized through misinformation, radicalization tactics, and online communities designed to create a new wave of extremists. Klan ideology merges with skinheads, militia groups, and online forums. The movement no longer needed robes to thrive. It had entered an era where white supremacy could flourish under different names, in different forms, with different strategies. As the Ku Klux Klan faded from mainstream visibility, its ideology did not disappear, it simply reshaped itself, merging with other extremist movements that carried forward white supremacist ideals under new banners. The Klan, once dominant in public racial terror, became just one faction in a broader resurgence of white nationalism, blending into militia groups, underground skinhead networks, and the rapidly emerging landscape of online extremism. The robes, the cross burnings, the overt racial intimidation. These faded into history, replaced with new strategies, new symbols, and new ways of spreading hate in the modern era. The rise of white power skinhead gangs in the 1980s and 1990s provided an avenue for Klan ideology to evolve outside its traditional framework. Unlike the older, more formalized Klan chapters, white power skinheads rejected the ceremonial aspects of Klan culture, favoring street-level violence, military-style organization, and open gang warfare. Their appearance was different: shaved heads, combat boots, neo-Nazi tattoos. But their mission remained the same: racial terror, ethnic cleansing, and the promotion of white dominance through fear and brute force. Across cities, these gangs formed violent enclaves, recruiting disenfranchised youth, using music and underground propaganda to indoctrinate a new generation of extremists, ensuring that white supremacist ideology would persist without needing the Klan's historical imagery. At the same time, anti-government militia movements flourished, fueled by economic instability, political distrust, and an increasing resentment toward multiculturalism and immigration. Former Klansmen, recognizing that the Klan's name was now more of a liability than an asset, joined these militia networks, embedding their racial ideology within a broader framework of so-called patriotism. These groups claimed allegiance to the Constitution, to traditional American values, to self-sufficiency, but beneath the surface, their mission was clear: opposing black political gains, demonizing immigrants, reinforcing white nationalist narratives, and promoting armed resistance against perceived government oppression. The Klan had taught these men how to terrorize communities. They simply adapted their methods for a new political reality. Then came the explosion of the internet, which fundamentally changed the way white supremacist ideology was spread and consumed. In previous decades, extremist recruitment required physical meetings, pamphlets, underground gatherings. But now, hate had a digital home, unrestricted by geography, law enforcement oversight, or traditional barriers to entry. Suddenly, individuals who would never have encountered Klan ideology in their daily lives could be radicalized online, exposed to white nationalist propaganda, conspiracy theories, and recruitment tactics designed to lure vulnerable individuals into extremism. Neo-Nazi forums, encrypted chat rooms, and online hate groups replaced the Klan's traditional meeting halls, offering a new frontier for racial hatred, one that no longer required formal membership, public affiliation, or physical engagement. Racism had always evolved to survive, and now its newest incarnation was taking shape. New forms of racism evolve coded language. New platforms, white nationalism. The days of burning crosses had ended, but white supremacy had found new ways to thrive, adapting to the digital age, political landscapes, and cultural shifts with frightening precision. As white supremacist ideology adapted to the modern era, its outward expression became more subtle, more calculated, weaving itself into mainstream conversations without the overt symbols of the past. The coded language used by extremists allowed them to spread their message without immediate detection, replacing explicit racial slurs with dog whistles. Phrases that carried hidden meanings, designed to reinforce white nationalist ideals while appearing politically neutral. Instead of public declarations of segregation, terms like heritage not hate, traditional values, and Western civilization were weaponized to evoke nostalgia for racial hierarchy without directly calling for it. Hate had also found new platforms, abandoning traditional recruitment tactics in favor of social media algorithms, anonymous forums, and encrypted messaging apps. Extremists used online communities to radicalize individuals, feeding misinformation, historical revisionism, and pseudo-intellectual arguments that reframed white supremacist narratives as intellectual debates rather than extremist ideology. Platforms once used for casual discussion and gaming became breeding grounds for neo-Nazi groups, allowing individuals to be drawn into extremistry without realizing they were being recruited. White nationalism had shifted from a fringe movement to a coordinated digital campaign, using viral propaganda, meme culture, and algorithm-driven manipulation to push its influence further than the Klan could ever imagined in previous decades. Politicians, media personalities, and influencers, some knowingly, others unknowingly, amplified these narratives, legitimizing them in public discourse, allowing racism to persist under the guise of nationalism, cultural preservation, and free speech absolutism. By the time the 2010s arrived, the remnants of the Klan's ideology had fully merged with modern hate groups, manifesting in violent street movements, political infiltration, and mass mobilization efforts disguised as grassroots activism. The Klan no longer marched through Washington, D.C., in white robes, but its spirit was alive in the violent rallies of Charlottesville, in the insurrection at the Capitol, in the rise of extremist militias, and the growing normalization of white supremacist talking points in mainstream discourse. Echoes in the present. Charlottesville, Capitol riots, and beyond, the spirit of the Klan survives through modern hate groups, evolving through digital radicalization, political narratives, and violent acts that echo the terror of the past. The resurgence of white nationalist movements in the modern era has echoed the tactics of the Ku Klux Klan, adapting the same messages of racial dominance, but with new symbols, new methods, and new platforms. While the Klan itself has diminished into small, fragmented factions, its ideology persists, spreading through organized hate groups, militant nationalist networks, and radicalized online communities. Charlottesville's Unite the Right rally in 2017 was one of the clearest demonstrations that white supremacist extremism had not disappeared. It had merely evolved. Marchers carrying tiki torches stormed through the University of Virginia, chanting explicit white supremacist slogans, declaring their movement not in secrecy, but openly in the streets, much like the Klan did decades ago. Their goal was not only intimidation, but mass visibility, making it clear that white nationalist ideology had re-entered mainstream discourse, fueled by online radicalization, political rhetoric, and coded language that disguised hate as patriotism. The violence that followed, clashes with anti-racist protesters, the murder of Heather Heyer, the unapologetic embrace of Nazi imagery, was a chilling reminder that extremism had adapted, modernized, and refused to disappear. The Capitol riots on January 6, 2021, revealed another aspect of this transformation: the direct political mobilization of white supremacist groups, many of which had once embraced Klan-style tactics, but had now integrated themselves into broader nationalist movements. The insurrection was fueled by misinformation, conspiracy theories, and long-standing racial grievances, leading to an attempted overthrow of democratic processes. Among the rioters were members of far-right militias, neo-Nazi organizations, and extremists who had abandoned traditional Klan symbolism but carried forward its legacy. Their actions, storming government offices, calling for executions, violently clashing with law enforcement, were textbook examples of white nationalist terror. The Klan no longer burns crosses as its primary act of intimidation, but its legacy remains unmistakable in these modern demonstrations of supremacy and hate. The visuals have changed. The robes replaced by militia uniforms. The fiery crosses traded for tiki torches and digital propaganda. But the core remains the same. Crosses are less frequent, but tiki torches march in daylight now. The symbols of terror have changed, but the message remains chillingly familiar. Where once the Ku Klux Klan relied on hooded figures in the dead of night, cloaked in secrecy, modern white supremacists march openly, their torches held high, their chants unfiltered, their presence unhidden. The shift isn't just cosmetic. It's a calculated evolution, designed to adapt hatred to a new era, to repurpose fear under a different guise, one that allows extremists to recruit, to influence, and to spread their ideology without the immediate rejection that comes with Klan imagery. The Charlottesville rally in 2017 was a visceral demonstration of this transformation. gone were the robes and masks of the past. Instead, a mass of young men, dressed in khakis and polos, carrying tiki torches, stormed the streets, chanting slogans ripped from Nazi Germany. Their presence was not hidden. It was broadcast live, shared on social media, documented by journalists. A public show of force designed to declare that white nationalism was not fading, but reasserting itself in broad daylight. The violence that followed, the attacks on counter-protesters, the murder of Heather Heyer, the unapologetic display of Nazi salutes, proved that the tactics of the Klan had merely evolved. Terror was no longer confined to secret meetings and midnight raids. It was now part of mainstream political discourse, lurking within conversations about nationalism, immigration, and identity. The January 6 Capitol riots further illustrated this dangerous shift. What had once been fringe movements confined to underground groups had now moved into the halls of government itself, with extremists, militia members, and white supremacists leading an assault on democracy, using tactics rooted in racial intimidation, mob violence, and authoritarian aggression. The rioters were not masked Klansmen, but they carried the same spirit. The belief that violence could force political control, that intimidation could silence opposition, that democracy itself was a threat to their vision of racial hierarchy. Some carried Confederate flags, others wore symbols of far-right militias, and many had spent years absorbing extremist rhetoric through online channels, radicalized in forums where Klan ideology had quietly merged with newer forms of white nationalism. These events were not isolated. They were symptoms of a larger truth. The Klan's legacy had never truly disappeared. Despite court convictions, political defeats, and generational shifts, it had woven itself into American institutions, online spaces, political movements, ensuring that even when its name faded, its influence remained intact. The burning crosses may be less frequent, but the ideology that fueled them is still very much alive, repackaged, rebranded, and spread through new methods, new leaders, new platforms. The legacy of the Klan remains etched into America's soil and psyche. Its history is not just a relic, it is a shadow that stretches into the present, shaping conversations, fueling movements, and ensuring that the fight against racial terror is far from over. The legacy of the Ku Klux Klan is not just a dark chapter in history, it is a stain woven into the very fabric of American society, lingering in its laws, its institutions, its cultural narratives. For more than a century, the Klan was a physical force, a movement defined by rituals, robes, terror, and organized acts of racial violence. But even as its formal presence diminished, its ideology never disappeared, embedding itself within systemic oppression, political movements, and the persistent social structures that ensure racial hierarchy endures. The Klan's historical influence is evident in redlining policies that shaped black neighborhoods, voter suppression tactics that disproportionately target black and immigrant communities, police practices that continue to echo Jim Crow-era racial bias, and the normalization of white nationalist rhetoric in political spaces, where once Klan robes dictated social order. The burning crosses may have faded, but their message persists in the unspoken barriers, the economic inequalities, the coded language that allows racism to operate without ever saying its name outright. A Klan was always more than just the men who donned its robes. It was a philosophy, a system of oppression built on the belief that white supremacy must be defended at any cost. And though the organization itself is fractured, reduced to fringe groups and weakened remnants, the violence it embodied has not vanished. It has merely transformed. Modern hate groups may no longer wear the Klan's name, but they carry its mission, adopting its tactics, replicating its strategies, ensuring that racial terror remains an active force, despite the world's progress toward justice. The insurrectionists who stormed the Capitol in 2021, the white nationalist groups who march openly in city streets, the online radicalization networks that spread conspiracy theories rooted in race-based fear. These are the echoes of the Klan, manifestations of its influence in new forms, on new platforms, under different disguises. Hate does not simply die, it adapts, waiting for the right moment to emerge again, repackaged for a new generation, reinforced by history's willingness to forget the past too soon. The Klan is no longer just a group, it is a symbol of the violence born from supremacy. Its robes are unnecessary now. Its ideology has found ways to live on, hidden within systems that refuse to let go of the power it once wielded. The Ku Klux Klan, once a clearly defined organization, has transcended its own name, its own membership, its own historical timeline. It is no longer just a group, it is a lasting emblem of supremacy, driven violence, an ideology that has been absorbed into institutions, movements, political rhetoric, and social systems that do not require robes, oaths, or ceremonies to achieve their goals. The Klan did not simply vanish. It rebranded, spreading its influence through coded language, policy decisions, law enforcement biases, and cultural fears that continue to dictate the trajectory of racial and national identity in America. The systematic terror once carried out in the dead of night by masked men on horseback has evolved into forms that are less obvious, less theatrical, but no less insidious. It now exists within laws designed to restrict voting access for marginalized communities, in economic barriers that ensure generational poverty among Black and immigrant populations, in the selective enforcement of justice that disproportionately punishes the oppressed while shielding the powerful. It has embedded itself in political discourse, where fear-mongering about immigration, crime, and cultural erosion carries echoes of Klan-era propaganda, rebranded to sound palatable, but rooted in the same ideology. The modern landscape of white supremacy does not require membership cards or initiation rituals. It thrives in the institutions built to maintain power structures, in the media that subtly amplifies racist narratives while dismissing calls for justice, in the social hierarchies that continue to elevate whiteness as the default, the ideal, the unchallenged standard. The Klan's presence may be fractured, but its principles remain intact, adopted by those who recognize that outright affiliation is no longer necessary when the system itself does the work for them. This is why the Klan is not merely a historical relic. It is a reflection, a mirror held up to America, revealing its darkest impulses, its unresolved conflicts, its refusal to fully reckon with the legacy of white supremacy that has shaped its institutions since the beginning. To look away from that reflection is to ignore the warning signs, to pretend that hate only exists in past decades, rather than in present policies. To believe that progress alone is enough to erase an ideology that has proven its ability to endure. Conclusion: a hooded mirror of America, the Klan is not a relic, it is a reflection. A reminder that supremacy-driven violence was never just about the men who wore robes. It was about the world that allowed them to thrive. The Ku Klux Klan was never just a secret order, a band of extremists, a rogue faction, operating outside the boundaries of American society. It was an undeniable part of the nation's foundation, woven into the political, legal, and economic structures that shape daily life. For over a century, its reach extended far beyond the men who wore the robes, its ideology infecting institutions that allowed white supremacy to thrive under the guise of law, tradition, and national identity. It was tolerated, not just through silence, but through active participation. Police officers who refused to arrest Klansmen, judges who dismissed cases against lynchers, politicians who sought its endorsements, business owners who funded its rallies. These were not just outside observers, but willing accomplices, contributors to the unchallenged reign of racial terror. The Klan was never a fringe movement. At its height, it was a force legitimized by local governments, backed by industries, protected by courts, and defended by public sentiment. Even as its symbols faded, its legacy remained embedded in housing policies, redlining laws, voter suppression tactics, and economic disparities that ensured black and marginalized communities would remain restricted, vulnerable, and systematically oppressed. Even in its decline, the Klan's spirit remained alive through groups that absorbed its methods, politicians who rebranded its rhetoric, and digital platforms that spread its ideology under different names. It did not require cross-burnings anymore. Its influence had become institutionalized, transformed into coded language, structural inequalities, and the normalization of hate under politically acceptable euphemisms. To view the Klan as a relic is to ignore the reality of its lasting impact. To assume that its disappearance from headlines means its power has been erased. But power does not vanish. It adapts, reshapes, finds new avenues to survive. And the Klan's power lay not just in its violence, but in what America allowed, in the laws that remained unchanged, in the histories that remained unspoken, in the silence that ensured white supremacy was never truly dismantled, only repackaged. Its power lay not just in its violence, but in what America allowed. Even without the robes, its presence endures, shaping the present as much as it did the past. The Ku Klux Klan did not operate in isolation. It thrived not only because of the men who carried out its acts of terror, but because the society around them permitted it. For more than a century, the Klan relied on the silence of bystanders, the complicity of institutions, and the willingness of entire communities to look away, choosing comfort over justice, choosing denial over intervention. Its power was never just about the physical violence. It was about the structures that protected it, the politicians who enabled it, the legal systems that refused to dismantle it, and the cultural narratives that excused it. Time and time again, the Klan's reign of terror was allowed to flourish because America refused to confront its own role in the system. Laws were crafted to maintain segregation, not dismantle it. Trials were held to acquit Klansmen, not convict them. Stories of racial brutality were dismissed as exaggerations, ignored by newspapers, buried by history books. Every era of Klan violence, from Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement, from the Jim Crow years to the digital age of white nationalism, was met with a refusal to take decisive action, an unwillingness to acknowledge that white supremacy had been deeply ingrained in the American identity. Even when the Klan began to decline, its legacy persisted, not through openly declared allegiance, but through economic inequalities, legal loopholes, voter suppression tactics, and the slow erosion of civil rights gains. White supremacy did not disappear just because the Klan became weaker. It simply found new ways to survive, new avenues to influence politics, new narratives to justify its existence. At every moment where change seemed possible, where justice could have been served, America hesitated. And that hesitation ensured the Klan's legacy endured far beyond its robes and rituals. The story of the Klan is a story of silence, complicity, and darkness. Its violence was only one part of the equation. The greater crime was the world that allowed it to happen. Time and time again. The story of the Ku Klux Klan is not just a story of violence, but a story of silence. The silence of those who refused to speak out. The silence of institutions that refused to intervene. The silence of a nation that allowed terror to flourish in its midst. It is a story of complicity, not simply of Klansmen themselves, but of the judges who dismissed their crimes, the politicians who courted their favor, the law enforcement officers who looked the other way, the businesses that profited from their presence, and the communities that whispered in agreement but never openly condemned. It is a story of darkness, not just in the literal midnight raids and shadowed cross burnings, but in the deeper, more insidious refusal to confront what lay beneath the hood. The reality that white supremacy was not confined to the Klan, but embedded in the nation's foundations. For more than a century, America has attempted to distance itself from the Klan, to treat it as a historical anomaly, an unfortunate blight that eventually faded, a phenomenon that was defeated by legal victories and changing times. But the truth is far less comforting. The Klan was never just a rogue faction. It was an expression of the racial ideology that shaped laws, industries, housing policies, voting rights, and justice systems. Its name may have lost its power, but its legacy remains deeply woven into structures designed to perpetuate inequality. The same fears, the same hate, the same methods of exclusion and suppression continue to evolve, adapting to the modern age, thriving beneath different names, within different movements, expressed through different strategies, but built on the same foundation the Klan once stood upon. To truly break that cycle, to ensure that white supremacy is not simply reshaped for each new era, but truly dismantled, requires an unflinching confrontation with that history. A confrontation that does not look away, does not sanitize, does not soften the truth for the sake of comfort. A confrontation that does not absolve the systems that allowed the Klan to flourish, but instead examines them fully, unhooded, exposed, and undeniable. And only by confronting that history in full, unhooded, can the cycle end. No more disguises, no more denial, no more pretense that hatred only exists in the past. Only by confronting this history in full, unhooded, can the cycle end. The legacy of the Klan is not just something of the past. It remains a warning, a lesson written in blood and silence. It thrived not simply because of those who actively wore its robes, but because of the society that allowed it, the laws that reinforced its ideology, the institutions that refused to stop it. It adapted, changed forms, rebranded itself, but it never truly vanished. To break that cycle means refusing to forget, refusing to downplay, refusing to excuse what history has shown us time and time again. That white supremacy does not disappear on its own. It must be recognized, challenged, and dismantled, not just in the pages of textbooks, but in the systems that still echo its influence. This was our attempt to tell you the truth, as accurately as possible, based on historical records and verified accounts. Of course, history is vast and complex, and there may be nuances, missing details, and perspectives that could add more depth to this story. If something felt incomplete, or if further research is needed, we encourage you to explore more, question more, and seek the broader narrative that history offers. And now, it's time to rest. Close your eyes, let the weight of the past drift away, and find comfort in the fact that knowledge, awareness, is the first step to change. Sleep well. Tomorrow is another day.